Hey you! Yeah, if you're already lying down, pillow tucked just right, maybe the lights are already low perfect. Because what I'm about to tell you is best understood in the dark. Settle in. Here's a question that sounds simple but really isn't. What was the scariest thing about being alive in medieval Europe? Was it the plague, the wars, the kings who could take your head off for looking at them wrong? All valid guesses. But the answer that most historians quietly agree on and that almost nobody talks about is this. It was the night. Just the night. Plain, ordinary, absolute darkness. And tonight we're going to talk about the one small, quiet, almost ridiculous thing that changed that forever. A candle. Welcome back, everyone. I am so glad you're here. All right, let's go back. Way back. Picture Europe sometime around the 11th century. Not the romanticized version you see in paintings, the gold light, the warm hearths, the flickering torches lining grand castle halls. Forget all of that. That's the version made by people who had electricity when they painted it. The real Europe, for most real people, looked like this. The sun goes down and everything stops. Not slows down, stops. You cannot see your hand in front of your face. The road outside your door becomes invisible. The forest at the edge of the village, the one that was already a little frightening in the afternoon, becomes something else entirely at night. Something you do not walk into. Something you do not even look toward. Historians who study this period describe the darkness of pre-industrial nights as something modern people genuinely cannot comprehend. We live in an age of light pollution so thick that most of us have never actually seen a truly dark sky. On a clear night, far from any city, you can see the Milky Way not as a faint smear, but as a solid, overwhelming band of stars so bright it almost feels like it has weight. That is the sky our ancestors saw every single night. And while it was breathtaking, it was also a reminder of something. They were very, very small, and the darkness around them was very, very large. Now, I want you to understand something that took me a while to really absorb when I first started digging into this history. Darkness in this era was not just an inconvenience. It was not like forgetting to charge your phone. It was a genuine daily structural problem for society. Think about it this way. If you are a farmer in 13th century England, your entire livelihood depends on light. You plant by light, you harvest by light, you repair your tools and feed your animals, and tend to your sick children all by light. The moment the sun sets, you are done. Not because you are lazy, because you literally cannot see. And here is the part that gets me every time I think about it. This was not seasonal. This was not a winter problem. This was every single day of every single year for every single person who was not wealthy enough to afford artificial light. And what counted as artificial light back then? A fire, a torch. Or if you were lucky, if you had saved your fat drippings carefully, if you had the right materials, something that resembled a candle. The average peasant household in medieval Europe went to bed when the sky went dark, somewhere around 7 or 8 in the evening during winter months. Not because they were tired necessarily, but because there was simply nothing else to do. No reading, no working, no visiting neighbours across the village. Darkness enforced a kind of social silence that we've completely lost the ability to imagine. A historian named A. Roger E. Kirsch, who spent over 2 decades researching this, published findings, showing that pre-industrial Europeans actually slept in 2 separate shifts. They would go to sleep at dark, wake up around midnight for an hour or 2, and then sleep again until dawn. During that middle of the night wakeful period, people would pray, talk quietly with their spouse, think, or sometimes visit neighbours, but only if they lived very close by, and only if there was some source of light to guide the way. That in-between hour had a name. They called it the watch. And the candle, even a rough, smelly, imperfect candle, was often what made that quiet middle hour possible. Now let me give you a sense of just how much darkness shaped not just people's nights, but their entire psychology. European cities in this era had curfew laws, and the word curfew literally comes from the old French phrase meaning cover the fire. At a certain hour by law you were supposed to extinguish your fire and go inside. Not just because fire was dangerous, though it absolutely was, but because moving around after dark was inherently suspicious. If you were out at night without a light and without good reason, you were assumed to be up to no good. Courts in medieval England routinely used nighttime movement as evidence of criminal intent. Being in the dark outside at night was not just uncomfortable, it was legally risky. And this is the part that I find quietly devastating, honestly. The poorest people, the ones who most needed to work longer hours to survive, were the ones most imprisoned by darkness. A wealthy merchant could afford candles, could afford oil lamps, could afford to extend his working day by hours. A peasant could not. Darkness was not just an inconvenience, it was a mechanism of poverty. It kept poor people poor by literally limiting the hours they could be productive. There is a detail from historical records of rural England in the medieval period that has stayed with me since I first read it. Families would plan the slaughter of their animals specifically for the purpose of collecting the fat for light. Not just meat for food, fat for burning. The timing of when you killed your animals was partly determined by when you needed light most. Winter was coming. You needed tallow. So you killed in autumn, rendered the fat and used it to buy yourself a few more hours of visibility before the long dark months closed in. That is not a small thing. That is a society organizing itself around the problem of light. That is how fundamental this issue was. And yet, and here is where the story starts to become something genuinely beautiful, humans are spectacularly stubborn about refusing to give up. We do not just sit in the dark, we never have. Long before anyone refined candle making into a craft, long before guilds and chandlers and beeswax and all of the extraordinary things we're going to explore together, people were already solving this problem with whatever they had. Dried reeds, kitchen grease, a scrap of cloth, the most basic, humble, almost laughably simple ingredients. Out of that stubbornness, out of that very human refusal to simply accept the dark came one of the most quietly consequential inventions in the history of civilization. And the first version of that invention, it was not glamorous. It did not smell good. It was not the elegant taper candle you picture on a dinner table. It was something far more interesting than that, and honestly something I find kind of wonderful in the way that all genuinely practical things are wonderful. It was a rushlight, and the story of how something that basic a reed soaked in animal fat quietly changed the rhythm of human life across an entire continent. Well, that is exactly where we're headed next. Because here is what I've come to believe after spending a long time with this history: the candle was never really about light. Not at its core, it was about time. It was about the extra hour, the stolen evening, the moment of warmth between the end of the workday and the absolute dark. It was about the quiet, stubborn insistence that the night belonged to people too, not just to fear and wolves and things that made sounds outside the door. And it started, as so many important things do, with something almost impossibly simple. Stay with me. So a rushlight. If you have never heard that word before, do not worry. Most people haven't. And honestly, that is part of what makes this story so worth telling, because the rushlight is one of those things that was absolutely everywhere for thousands of years, in homes, in monasteries, in the hands of soldiers and farmers and mothers, putting children to bed, and then it just quietly disappeared, and history barely noticed. No monument, no museum wing dedicated to its legacy, just silence. Which is a shame, because the rushlight might be the most democratically important invention in the story of human light. Let's build one together. In our minds, I mean no need to go rummaging through the kitchen. Imagine you're living somewhere in rural England. Let's say it's the 13th century, give or take a few decades. It is late summer, and you know what that means. The days are already starting to shorten, and winter with its brutal early sunsets is only a few months away. So you do what your grandmother did, and her grandmother before her. You go to the edge of the marsh or the riverbank near your village and you harvest rushes. Now, rushes not to be confused with the decorative kind people use in flower arrangements today. These are specific plants. Tall, slender, cylindrical. They grow in damp, boggy ground all across northern and western Europe. And the part you want is the pith, the soft, spongy core inside the green outer skin. That pith is remarkable stuff. It is light, it absorbs fat beautifully, and when dried and soaked correctly, it burns with a small, steady flame for a surprisingly long time. The process of preparing a rushlight was something you did with your hands, slowly, almost meditatively. You would harvest the rushes in late summer when they were at their tallest and most full of pith. Then you would peel away the outer green skin carefully, not entirely because you needed to leave one thin strip of skin along the length of the rush to act as a kind of structural support, otherwise the whole thing would collapse when it got hot. That strip of skin was the difference between a working rushlight and a pile of sizzling mush. Then you would dry the peeled rushes, and then, and this is the part I find genuinely satisfying to picture, you would melt down your kitchen fat, whatever you had. Drippings from roasting meat, the rendered fat from a slaughtered animal, sometimes mixed with a bit of beeswax if you were lucky enough to have any. And you would lay the dried rushes into that warm fat and let them soak, not for a moment, for a good long while, until the pith was thoroughly saturated. Then you lifted them out, laid them on a piece of bark or a flat stone to cool and solidify, and that was it. You had light. Humble, imperfect, slightly greasy, faintly smoky light, but light. Now here is a detail I want you to really sit with because I think it puts everything into perspective. A naturalist named Gilbert White, writing in his famous journal in the 1780s so well into what most people would call the modern era, took the time to precisely document how rushlights worked in the English countryside of his time. And what he found was this: a standard rushlight about 2 feet and 4 inches in length would burn for exactly 57 minutes. He tested it. He timed it. 57 minutes of light from a reed soaked in fat. That was not nothing. That was for a family with very little that was precious. That was the difference between getting 1 more hour of work done mending a shirt, grinding grain, tending to a sick animal, and simply sitting in the dark. But here is what Gilbert White also noted, and what I think is one of the most quietly brilliant pieces of practical ingenuity I have ever come across. A rushlight burned longer when held at an angle, not vertical, at an angle roughly 45 degrees. Because when the flame tilts, it draws the melted fat upward into the pith more efficiently, slowing the burn rate. So the rushlight holders, the little metal clips or forked pieces of iron that people use to hold their rushlights, were designed specifically to grip the rush at that angle. Someone figured that out. Some unknown person centuries before anyone understood combustion chemistry through pure observation and trial and error worked out that angle and passed it on, generation to generation. I think about that person sometimes. No name, no record, just a quiet observation made in a cold room somewhere in England or France or Germany, shared with a neighbour, spread through a village, and eventually embedded in the design of a tool that millions of people used for hundreds of years. That is how most human knowledge actually travels. Not through books, not through universities, through one person watching a flame and saying, "Wait, try it this way. Can I ask you something? Do you know where your closest source of light is right now?" Without thinking too hard about it, a lamp, your phone screen, maybe a nightlight down the hall. You probably didn't have to plan for it. You didn't save fat all autumn to afford it. It was just there. That contrast between what light costs now and what it cost then is something I genuinely believe we have lost the ability to feel. And I think we lose something important when we can't feel it, because the rushlight was not used just in the distant medieval past. It persisted. It persisted in rural European households well into the 18th century, and in some of the most remote parts of England and Scotland. Traces of rushlight use survived into the early 19th century. This was not a primitive relic that enlightened people quickly abandoned. This was a technology so practical, so cheap, and so effective for its purpose that it simply kept being used for as long as people needed it. There is a particular detail from the historical record of rural Scotland that has stuck with me since I first came across it. In crofting communities, the small tenant farms that dotted the Scottish Highlands families would sometimes gather together in the evenings specifically to share a single rushlight, not because they couldn't each have one, but because gathering together under one light was more efficient and more sociable. They called these gatherings by different names in different regions, but the structure was the same. People would sit together in the warmest room of a home, working with their hands, spinning, mending, carving, and talking. One light, many people. And the work and the conversation happened simultaneously because the light required it. Now compare that to your average Tuesday evening in the modern world. Separate rooms, separate screens, separate little pools of personal light. I am not saying one is better than the other. I genuinely love my separate screen. And my separate room, I will be honest about that. But there is something in that image of people gathered under one small flame that feels like something we replaced without fully realizing what we were giving up. The rushlight also had a social dimension that I find fascinating from an economic history perspective, because making rushlights was labour that happened primarily within the household, primarily done by women and older children, and primarily timed around the agricultural calendar. You harvested in late summer, you rendered fat in autumn, usually when animals were slaughtered before winter. You made your supply of rushlights in one concentrated effort, and then you lived off that supply until you needed to make more. This meant that light quite literally was something families manufactured for themselves. It was not purchased from a shop, it was not delivered. It grew in the marsh and dripped from the bones of your livestock. Every rushy flicker on your wall was the product of someone's specific labour on a specific afternoon. That relationship between the human body, the natural world, and the light in your home was utterly direct. There was no intermediary, and that directness changed things in ways that are hard to quantify, but easy to feel when you think about them. When your light costs you something real-time effort, the fat you saved for weeks, you do not waste it. You sit close together. You work while the flame lasts. You notice when it is getting low. You plan around it. I want to pause here on one more thing before we move on, because I think it matters. The rushlight, for all its simplicity, represented something genuinely significant in the history of how humans organized their lives. It was the first widely accessible form of artificial light. Not just for kings, not just for churches, not just for merchants wealthy enough to afford candles made with care and rendered wax. The rushlight was for everyone, the labourer, the widow, the shepherd, the child who needed to find her way to the barn before dawn. It democratized in the most basic possible sense the idea that darkness was not inevitable, that you had some small power over the night, that even if you owned almost nothing, you could still manufacture light out of marsh grass and kitchen drippings. That is not a small thing. That is in its quiet way a kind of freedom. And yet, and here is where the story begins to reveal its deeper layers, not all light was created equal. Not even close. While the poor were soaking rushes in bacon fat and timing their evenings by a flame that lasted 57 minutes, there was another world of candle making happening, just a few social classes above them. A world with very different materials, very different smells, very different meanings. A world where what you burned in your home announced without a single word exactly who you were and how much you were worth. Because in pre-industrial Europe, the candle you lit was not just a tool, it was a statement. And the distance between a rushlight and a beeswax candle, which sounds on the surface like a difference in chemistry, was actually a difference in power in religion, in identity, in everything that mattered. That is exactly the door we are walking through next. There is a moment I keep coming back to whenever I think about this history. Imagine 2 rooms, same city, same night, same cold air pressing against the window shutters. In one room, a tallow candle is burning, the kind made from rendered beef or mutton fat, the kind that most households in medieval Europe burned every single evening of their lives. And in the other room, maybe only a few streets away, a beeswax candle is burning. Same size roughly, same basic purpose, both providing light to someone sitting up late. But those 2 rooms smell completely different. They feel completely different, and the people inside them occupy completely different worlds. That contrast, that gap between a tallow flame and a beeswax flame is one of the most quietly revealing windows into how medieval European society was actually structured. Not through laws written in Latin, not through the formal hierarchy of nobles and clergy and peasants, but through something as immediate and sensory as the smell of the light in your home. Let's start with tallow, because that is where most of this story lives. Tallow, for anyone who hasn't come across the word, is rendered animal fat specifically from beef or mutton. To make it usable for candles, you had to melt the raw fat down, strain it, and clarify it. The process was called rendering, and rendering tallow in any quantity produced a smell that I can only describe as insistently present. There is no polite way to say this. It smelled like hot, slightly rancid meat. Because that is essentially what it was. The reason tallow smells so strongly when it burns, and this is something medieval people had no way of knowing, but we understand now, is the glycerin content. Animal fat is full of glycerin, and when glycerin burns, it releases compounds that are immediately and unpleasantly recognizable to the human nose. You cannot mistake it. You cannot ignore it. If you have ever been near a kitchen where something fatty was burning, you have some vague sense of what we're talking about, but amplify that, close the windows and breathe it for several hours a night every night through an entire winter. That was the olfactory reality of life for most people in pre-industrial Europe. And here is the thing that I find genuinely remarkable. People knew it was unpleasant. They were not somehow desensitized to it or unaware. Historical sources from as far back as the early medieval period describe the smell of tallow candles and rendering workshops as something to be managed, contained, dealt with. City governments across Europe passed ordinances, actual written laws requiring tallow chandlers to locate their workshops away from residential areas near the butchers and the tanners, where the smell could blend into the general industrial atmosphere of those districts without offending everyone nearby. In some cities, the rendering of tallow was outright banned within the city walls during certain hours or seasons. This was not a minor inconvenience. This was civic governance shaped directly by the byproducts of candle making. Think about that for a moment. The smell of how ordinary people lit their homes was considered enough of a public problem that governments had to write laws about it, and yet tallow candles remained the dominant source of artificial light for the vast majority of Europeans for centuries, because what was the alternative? Sit in the dark. You put up with the smell, you opened a shutter if you had one, you got used to it. What choice did you have now? Let's cross the street. Let's walk into that other room, the one where the beeswax candle is burning. The difference is immediate, not subtle, not the kind of thing you have to concentrate to notice. A beeswax candle burning in a closed room smells faintly sweet. Warm and honey-like, which makes sense because beeswax is at its origin a product of the same hive that produces honey. The wax is secreted by worker bees to build the structure of the honeycomb. When you melt that wax and burn it, it releases something that the nose recognizes as clean, warm, almost edible. There is no glycerin. There are no harsh compounds. Just a gentle golden scent that fills the room in a way that tallow simply cannot. And beeswax burns differently, more completely, with less smoke, less soot, less of that thin black column of residue that tallow candles would deposit on walls and ceilings over time. A room lit regularly by beeswax candles was cleaner, smelled better, and had walls that stayed lighter in colour. A room lit by tallow candles, well, you can sometimes see the evidence of it in old buildings in the dark, staining above where candle sconces were mounted. So beeswax was better in almost every practical sense. Why then did most people not use it? The answer is almost embarrassingly simple. One full honeycomb, the labour of thousands of bees over weeks, yielded enough wax to make roughly one candle about 4 inches long, just to have the raw material. Then you still had to make the candle. The cost of beeswax relative to tallow was not 10% higher or 20%. It was categorically, dramatically, almost absurdly more expensive. Beeswax candles were luxury goods in the truest sense, not luxury in the modern marketing sense of a little bit of a splurge, but luxury in the original sense, something that only a very small portion of the population could consistently afford. In medieval England and France, the records that survive give us a fairly clear picture of just how sharp this divide was. Wax chandlers, the craftsmen who worked with beeswax, operated in an entirely different social and economic tier than tallow chandlers. They had separate guilds. In France, a wax chandler guild was documented as early as the year 1061. In London, the Wax Chandlers' Company existed prior to the year 1300 and eventually received its formal charter in 1484. These were prestigious organisations. Their members counted among their clients the royal household, the great cathedrals, the monasteries, the nobility. The tallow chandlers of London, meanwhile, received their coat of arms in 1456. Which is interesting because it tells you that even tallow chandlers could achieve a degree of formal civic recognition. But the social distance between the two groups was real and understood by everyone involved. Tallow was for the streets and the common hearth. Wax was for the altar and the great hall. And speaking of altars, this is where the story takes a turn that I find genuinely fascinating because it pulls in a dimension that goes far beyond economics. The Catholic Church, which was the central institution of European life throughout this entire period, had very specific opinions about what kind of candle was acceptable in the eyes of God. Papal decrees, actual official documents issued from Rome, specified that tallow was not to be used on the high altar. Only beeswax candles were considered sufficiently pure for the most sacred purposes of worship. This was not just a preference. This was doctrine. And the reasoning behind it is one of those moments where history gets wonderfully strange. There was a belief widespread in medieval Christian thought that bees occupied a unique and holy place in creation. One tradition held that bees were the only creatures not present in the Garden of Eden, that they came from somewhere else, or that they alone had not been touched by the fall of humanity. Another tradition, popular among monks who wrote about natural history and theology, simultaneously described the beehive as a model of the ideal Christian community, organised celibate in its worker bees, producing sweetness through disciplined labour and governed by a single queen, who medieval writers consistently described interestingly in terms that borrowed heavily from how they described the Virgin Mary. Whether you find that theology convincing or not is entirely your own business. But the point is that beeswax in the medieval Christian imagination was not just a better candle material, it was a morally superior one. The flame of a beeswax candle on an altar was not just illuminating the space. It was making a statement about purity, about devotion, about the proper relationship between the human and the divine. And this gave beeswax candles a sacred dimension that tallow simply could not touch, no matter how many of them you burned. Now let me ask you something, because I think this actually speaks to something universal, and not just medieval. Have you ever been in a space where the quality of the light itself changed how you felt? A candlelit restaurant versus fluorescent overhead lights. A cathedral with natural light coming through stained glass versus a community hall with industrial fixtures. The content of the space is the same, the people are the same, but the quality of the light does something to the air, to the mood, to the way your body holds itself. Medieval people felt this. They could not articulate it in the neurological terms we would use today, but they felt it. And the church, which was enormously sophisticated in its understanding of how environment shapes experience, understood that beeswax candles did something to the interior of a sacred space that tallow simply could not replicate. The cleaner flame, the warmer scent, the sense that the air itself was somehow different. These were not accidental features. They were part of an intentional construction of atmosphere. Which brings me to a dimension of this story that I think is quietly devastating if you sit with it long enough. The same institution, the church that declared beeswax the only acceptable medium for divine worship, was also the primary place that common people went for comfort, for community, for meaning. The parish church was in many villages the only public building that most people would ever enter with any regularity, and when they went there, they stepped from a world of tallow, smoky, smelly, imperfect, into a world of beeswax, clean, sweet, radiant. The church was, whether intentionally or not, embedding class into the very sensory experience of worship. You prayed under the light of a substance you could never afford at home. I've thought about that a lot, about what it does to a person to regularly experience beauty and warmth and clean golden light, in one specific context, the religious one, and then return home to the tallow candle guttering on the table. Does it make the church feel more sacred? Probably. Does it also make the gap between sacred and ordinary feel wider and more permanent? I think it must have. I think the candle was doing social and psychological work that went far, far beyond simple illumination. There is one more piece of this I want to give you before we move forward, because it completes the picture in a way that I find honestly quite moving. For the wealthiest households, the great noble families of England, France, Germany, beeswax candles were not just a practical necessity. They were a form of display. Court records and household accounts from the 14th and 15th centuries show that major aristocratic households burned beeswax candles in quantities that were by any reasonable measure extravagant. Not because they needed that much light, but because the abundance of clean, sweet-smelling beeswax candles communicated something important to every guest who walked through the door. It said we do not have to compromise. We do not have to smell like the rendering yard. We are above that. The historian Barbara Tuchman, writing about the 14th century and her remarkable study of that era, described how the courts of European nobility during this period used material excess as a form of political communication. Every detail, the quality of the fabric, the variety of food on the table, the number and type of candles burning in the great hall was a message. And the message was always the same: look at what we have, and you do not. The tallow candle and the beeswax candle were not just two solutions to the same problem. They were two languages, two ways of declaring without saying a word where you stood in the order of things. And the extraordinary truth is that this gap, this chasm between the candle of the poor and the candle of the powerful, existed for hundreds of years largely unchanged, until something happened that disrupted everything. Not a revolution, not a war, not a plague, Something quieter and in some ways more subversive than any of those things. A craft became a profession, and a profession became a guild, and a guild became in its own strange and fascinating way one of the most politically complicated institutions in the medieval city. The story of the chandler, the man or woman who stood between the raw materials and the finished flame, is one I have been looking forward to getting to, because it is not the story you expect. Not at all. The word itself is worth a moment. Chandler. Say it slowly. It has a weight to it, a kind of quiet dignity. It comes from the old French word for candle chandelle, which itself traces back to the Latin candela from candere, meaning to shine, to glow, to be bright. So the chandler was at his most literal a person defined by light, a keeper of brightness, a professional in the business of pushing back the dark, which sounds rather noble when you put it that way. And in some respects it genuinely was. But the daily reality of being a chandler in medieval Europe was considerably more complicated, considerably more political, and considerably more interesting than the romantic version suggests. Let me tell you about this profession, because I think the chandler is one of the most underestimated figures in the entire story of pre-industrial life. And it bothers me genuinely that most people have never given this person more than a passing thought. To understand the chandler, you first have to understand something about how medieval European cities actually worked. They were not organised the way modern cities are, with a mix of businesses scattered wherever rent was cheapest and zoning laws permitted. Medieval cities were organised by trade. Craftsmen and merchants of the same type clustered together on specific streets in specific neighbourhoods, sometimes in specific buildings. This was not accidental. It was how guilds functioned, and guilds were how almost every skilled trade was organised from roughly the 12th century onward across England, France, Germany, the Low Countries, and most of urban Europe. The guild was, and I want to be precise here because I think the word gets used loosely, not just a trade union in the modern sense. It was closer to a combination of a professional licensing board, a mutual aid society, a religious fraternity, and a small government. If you wanted to practice a craft in a medieval city, you needed to be part of the guild that governed that craft. If you were not, you could be fined, have your goods confiscated, or be driven out of the city. The guild set the prices, the guild set the standards. The guild decided who was allowed to work and under what conditions and for how long each day and in what parts of the city. And for the chandlers of medieval Europe, this system produced something genuinely remarkable and also genuinely contentious. Because by the 13th century candle making in England and France had not one guild but two, and they were completely separate, and they did not particularly like each other. The tallow chandlers and the wax chandlers. On the surface, this division might seem like a minor administrative detail. In practice, it was a formal recognition that these two groups of craftsmen occupied entirely different economic and social universes, even though they were technically making the same basic object. The tallow chandlers worked with rendered animal fat. They were closely associated physically and commercially with the butchers and the skinners, the people who processed animal carcasses for a living. Their workshops smelled accordingly. Their raw materials came from the slaughterhouse. There was a rough industrial quality to their trade that placed them firmly in the working-class tier of the urban craft economy. The wax chandlers, by contrast, sourced their primary material beeswax from beekeepers from merchants who imported wax from Flanders and the Baltic regions from the estates of monasteries that kept large apiaries. Their clients were the church, the nobility, the royal household. Their product was used in the most sacred and prestigious spaces in Europe, and they knew it. The social distance between a wax chandler supplying candles for Westminster Abbey and a tallow chandler making street lights for the night watch was not a small gap. It was a chasm, and both groups were invested in keeping that chasm clearly marked. In London, the Tallow Chandlers Company was formally organised around the year 1300, making it one of the older craft guilds in the city. In 1456, it was granted a coat of arms. Now, I want to pause on that for a second because I think it tells us something important. A coat of arms was not a trivial decoration. It was a formal declaration of civic standing, a statement that an organisation had earned a place in the permanent social order of the realm. For a guild whose members spent their days rendering animal fat and dipping wicks, that was a genuinely significant achievement. It meant that the tallow chandlers had accumulated enough wealth, enough political connections, and enough collective respectability to be recognised at a level typically associated with the nobility and the clergy. The Wax Chandlers Company of London had existed in some form prior to 1330. Records suggest informal organisation well before that, and acquired its formal royal charter in 1484. And here's an interesting detail from these early records in a tax list from the year 1319-11. Wax chandlers are identified as operating in the City of London, just 11. Not because there wasn't demand, there absolutely was, but because the economics of beeswax kept the number of viable wax chandlers naturally small. You needed wealthy clients and reliable supply chains to survive in that business. It was not a craft you entered without connections. But here is the part of the chandler's story that almost never gets told and that I find endlessly fascinating. The chandler was not simply a candle maker, not by a long stretch. The medieval chandler sold candles, yes, but over time the trade expanded in ways that seem almost random until you understand the underlying logic. By the later medieval period, a chandler's shop, particularly a tallow chandler's, might also sell vinegar, cheese, soap, cooking oil, sauces, and a variety of household supplies. Some chandlers moved into the grocery trade. Some became what we might call general merchants, using their established shop and their established customer relationships as a platform for selling whatever people needed. Why? Because the chandler's core business had one very important feature: it brought people through this door regularly. Light was not optional. Every household needed it. So the chandler had a built-in recurring customer base that most other tradespeople would have envied. And the smart ones leveraged that. There is an Old English term smearmongere that was used for chandlers in some early records, and it translates roughly as fat seller or greasemonger. Not the most glamorous professional title in history, I will grant you. But what it captures is the reality of the chandler's position at the intersection of food production, household supply, and the lighting trade. These were not neatly separated categories in the medieval economy. Fat was fat. It cooked your food, it waterproofed your boots, it lubricated your cart axles, it made your soap, and it lit your home. The person who dealt in fat dealt in all of these things to varying degrees. Now let's talk about the itinerant chandler, because not all chandlers had fixed shops. Not all of them waited behind a counter for customers to come to them. Some of them went to the customers. The itinerant chandler, the travelling candle maker who went from household to household, was a recognisable figure in medieval and early modern European life. And the way this worked was genuinely practical, in a way I find charming. A household would save its cooking fat throughout the year, the drippings from roasting meat, the rendered fat from butchering whatever accumulated in the kitchen over weeks and months. This was valuable. It was not thrown away. And when the itinerant chandler came through, you could have him take your saved fat and turn it into candles right there in your own yard or kitchen, using your own materials. You paid the chandler for his labour and his wick. You kept the candles. This arrangement made sense for both parties. The household did not need to travel to a shop or trust a middleman with their saved fat. The chandler did not need to source raw materials, they were provided. It was a service economy in the most direct possible sense, centuries before anyone used that phrase. And here is something that tends to surprise people when I mention it. A significant number of itinerant chandlers were women. Not in every region, not uniformly, but the historical record in England and France shows women working in this capacity travelling between households, making candles on site, managing small-scale trade. This was partly because the work was considered compatible with the domestic sphere in a way that heavier crafts were not. But it was also because the economics of itinerant chandlery did not require the capital investment of a guild-registered workshop. A woman who knew how to render fat and dip wicks could practice this trade with relatively few barriers operating in the informal margins of the craft economy. Which brings me to something worth sitting with. The guild system, for all its rigidity, had at least one provision that strikes me as quietly notable. In the London Chandlers' Guilds, as in many medieval trade guilds, a woman could inherit full guild membership from her deceased husband. She could take over the shop, employ the apprentices, fulfill the contracts, and operate as a full member of the organisation. This was not universal across all guilds. Some were exclusively male. But among the chandlers, the practical reality that a wife often knew the trade as well as or better than her husband, having worked alongside him for years, was formally recognised. This did not make medieval guild society egalitarian, it absolutely did not. But it does complicate the simple narrative that women in this period had no presence in skilled trades. They were there, they were often essential, they were just not always the ones whose names ended up in the formal records. Now the apprenticeship system within the Chandler Guilds deserves a moment because it structured the entire career path of anyone who wanted to practice this trade professionally. To become a chandler in a city like London or Paris, you would typically begin as an apprentice at somewhere between the ages of 12 and 14. You would be bound to a master chandler for a period of 7 years sometimes, more, sometimes slightly less, depending on the specific guild and the specific arrangement. During that time you lived in the master's household, you worked in the workshop, you learned every aspect of the trade, how to render tallow to the right consistency, how to prepare wicks from linen or hemp, how to dip candles evenly, how to pour moulds, how to calculate quantities, how to deal with suppliers, how to serve customers, how to manage the accounts. 7 years. Think about that commitment. You entered as a child and you emerged as a young adult with a marketable skill, and if your master was good and your work was solid with connections, that could help you establish yourself. After completing your apprenticeship, you became a journeyman, a qualified worker who could be employed by any master in the trade, but could not yet run your own shop. Then if you saved enough money and passed the examination set by the guild and had the right relationships, you could eventually become a master yourself, open your own workshop, take on your own apprentices, and the cycle continued. The whole system was designed, whether consciously or not, to produce craftsmen of consistent quality, while simultaneously controlling the number of practitioners in any given city. Guilds were, among other things, cartels. They limited competition, they maintained prices, and they made sure that the craft of chandlery, like every other organised craft, remained in the hands of people who'd gone through the proper channels. Outsiders who tried to sell candles without guild membership were called foreign chandlers, meaning not from foreign countries necessarily, but foreign to the guild, and they were actively policed. Guild wardens could enter premises, inspect goods, and confiscate candles made in violation of guild standards. Does this sound like it might have created some political tension? It absolutely did, especially when you consider that some of the most common violations involved exactly the thing that mattered most to ordinary buyers: price. During periods of shortage, a bad winter, a disruption in tallow supply, a spike in demand before a major religious festival, the temptation to charge more than guild-regulated prices was enormous, and the temptation to buy from cheaper unauthorized sources was equally strong, particularly for poorer households who were already stretching to afford light at all. The chandler, in other words, was not simply a craftsman. The chandler was a node in a vast, messy web of economic interest-supplier relationships, guild politics, municipal regulation, religious demand, class dynamics, and the daily negotiation of what ordinary people could actually afford. And standing at the centre of all of that, stirring a vat of rendered fat in a workshop that probably smelled quite strongly of what it was a person trying to make a living. There is something I find unexpectedly moving about that image. Not romantic exactly, but honest. The chandler was not glamorous. The chandler's trade was essential in a way that made glamour beside the point. Every church in Europe that burned candles before an altar, which is to say every church in Europe needed someone like this. Every household that lit a candle after dark, which is to say every household in Europe depended on this supply chain. The chandler stood at the intersection of the sacred and the practical, of poverty and privilege, of smell and light. And yet there is a shadow side to this story that we've been circling around, one that connects directly to that detail I mentioned earlier, about the city ordinances, about the smell, about the workshops being pushed to the edges of town. Because the regulation of candle making in European cities was not just about aesthetics, it was about something more urgent, something that when I first really understood it, made the whole picture feel darker and more complicated than I had expected. The smell of the rendering yard was not just unpleasant, in certain conditions it was dangerous. And the history of what could go wrong and did go wrong in the workshops of medieval chandlers reveals a side of this quiet craft that nobody put in the history books. That story is coming next, and I promise you it is not what you're expecting. Something I did not fully appreciate until I spent serious time with this history is just how much of what we call modern city planning, the idea that certain industries belong in certain places, that neighbourhoods should be organised around what is safe and livable, that a city has the right to tell a business where it can and cannot operate, how much of all of that traces directly back to one specific problem: the smell of rendering fat. I know that sounds almost comical. Urban planning policy descended from the question of where to put the smelly candle workshops. But follow me here, because the story of how European cities tried to manage the candle-making trade is genuinely one of the more revealing windows into how pre-industrial urban life actually worked, and what it cost people to live in close proximity to the industries that kept them alive. Let's set the scene properly. A medieval city was not large by modern standards, but it was extraordinarily dense. London in the 14th century had a population somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 people at its peak before the Black Death, packed into an area that a modern person could walk across in under an hour. Paris was similarly dense. The major German and Flemish trading cities Bruges, Ghent, Cologne were packed with craftsmen, merchants, clergy, animals, market stalls, and all the waste products of a functioning pre-industrial economy. Streets were narrow, buildings shared walls, drainage was minimal. The idea of personal space in the modern sense did not exist. Into this environment introduce a tallow chandler's workshop. The rendering process, the process of converting raw animal fat into usable tallow, required sustained intense heat, applied to large quantities of fatty tissue. You were essentially cooking fat for a long time at high temperature, clarifying it, separating out the solids, reducing it to a consistent liquid that could then be used for dipping candles. And the smell that this process produced was not contained. It was not something you could politely ignore if you happened to live nearby. It travelled. It settled into clothing, into hair, into the walls of adjacent buildings. On a warm day with little wind, it could be detected from a considerable distance. Medieval city governments, and here is where it gets interesting, were not passive about this. They were dealing with public complaints and they responded. Municipal records from cities across England and France, stretching back to at least the 13th century, show ordinances specifically targeting the tallow trade. In various cities at various points, the rendering of tallow was restricted to certain hours, certain seasons, or certain designated areas on the outskirts of town. In some cases, it was banned entirely within the city walls, at least during the warmer months when the smell was most acute and the fire risk was highest. The association with fire is something I want to dwell on for a moment because I think it is underappreciated just how genuinely dangerous a tallow chandler's workshop was in this environment. Think about what the process involved: a large vat, sometimes a very large vat of animal fat being heated over an open flame in a building made almost entirely of wood, surrounded by other buildings made almost entirely of wood, on a street where the garbage included straw sawdust and other highly flammable organic material. The fat, once it reached a certain temperature, would begin to spit and bubble. If it overheated, if someone made an error in managing the fire beneath it, if a sudden gust of wind sent an ember into the wrong place, the consequences could be catastrophic. And not just for the chandler, for the entire street. Medieval European cities burned. They burned regularly, they burned completely when they burned, and they burned fast. A fire that started in one building could consume an entire neighbourhood before anything resembling a response could be organised. The Great Fire of London in 1666 is the most famous example in English history, but it was far from unique. Major urban fires were a recurring feature of life in densely packed medieval and early modern European cities. And the crafts that involved sustained heat, smiths, bakers, potters, chandlers, were perennial sources of municipal anxiety because of their fire risk. The placement of chandlers near the butchers and the tanners was therefore not just about smell management, it was a form of risk containment. If the chandler's vat overheated and something went wrong, you wanted the disaster to happen in a part of the city where the buildings were already somewhat isolated from the densest residential areas where people were already somewhat accustomed to industrial risk, and where in the darkest calculations of municipal governance, the loss of property would be somewhat less catastrophic than if it happened in the middle of a merchant quarter or near a church. This is medieval zoning law. Crude, informal, and arrived at through a combination of complaints and catastrophe rather than any coherent planning theory, but it is zoning nonetheless, and it was driven in meaningful part by candles. Now here is the paradox that I find genuinely delightful in a dark sort of way. In the year 1415, the City of London officially began using tallow candles for street lighting. Lanterns fueled by tallow hung on hooks outside buildings along major thoroughfares lit by municipal employees who made the rounds each evening. This was a significant civic development, the first systematic attempt to light London streets after dark, and a real improvement in public safety and commerce for the city's inhabitants. The light that was making London streets safer and more navigable at night was produced from the same substance whose production the city had been trying to push out of residential neighbourhoods for over a century. The tallow chandlers were simultaneously being told not in these words, but in effect your product is essential to the life of this city, and your production process is an offence to everyone around you. Make us the candles, just make them somewhere we don't have to smell them. I've always found that tension between the indispensability of a thing and the undesirability of its production to be one of the more quietly honest things about how cities actually function. We want the food, we don't want the slaughterhouse nearby. We want the electricity, we don't want the power plant in our backyard. The medieval tallow chandler was living this tension 700 years before it had a name. Can you think of something in your own life that fits this pattern? Something you use without ever thinking about what went into making it or where it came from or what it smelled like when it was being produced, I suspect, if you think about it honestly. The list is longer than you might initially expect, but let's go deeper into the physical reality of the chandler's workshop, because I think most people, including me before I really dug into this, have a somewhat sanitized image of what it actually looked like. The workshop of a busy tallow chandler in a city like Paris or London in the 14th or 15th century was a place of sustained physical, exhausting labour. The rendering process alone could take an entire day for a large batch. You started with raw fat delivered from the butcher or slaughterer in large pieces, sometimes still partly covered in membrane and connective tissue. This had to be chopped, crushed, or otherwise broken down to allow the fat to render efficiently. Then it went into the vat and the fire went underneath, and you waited and watched and stirred, and that smell filled the workshop and drifted out into the street. Once the fat was rendered and strained, the actual candle making could begin. And here the primary technique for most of the medieval period was dipping, not pouring into moulds that came later with the introduction of mould casting in the 14th century, attributed in some historical sources to a French innovator known as Sieur de Breze. Before that, and for centuries afterward, in most ordinary workshops it was dipping. Manual, repetitive, patient dipping. A row of wicks made from twisted linen or hemp fibre, cut to length and hung from a wooden rod or frame, would be lowered together into the vat of melted tallow, held briefly lifted and allowed to drip and cool, then lowered again, and again, and again. Each pass added a thin layer of solidified fat to the wick. You needed anywhere from 15 to 30 passes, sometimes more, to build a candle of useful thickness. The pace was determined partly by skill and partly by temperature. If the tallow in the vat cooled too much, it would not adhere evenly. If it was too hot, the previous layers would melt back off as you dipped. The ideal temperature for dipping was something every experienced chandler knew through feel and through years of practice, rather than through any thermometer which was not yet an available tool. A skilled chandler could produce a significant number of candles in a working day. Some estimates from later period records suggest that a competent chandler working efficiently could dip and finish somewhere between 300 and 500 candles in a day, working from dawn to dusk with assistance. But that number came at a cost that was not purely economic. The chronic exposure to tallow fumes, the constant inhalation of the products of burning and heating animal fat over years and decades produced respiratory problems in many chandlers. Historical medical records from the later medieval period and the early modern period contain references to what practitioners of the time called conditions of the chest, associated with certain trades. Chandlers, along with smiths and bakers and others who worked near sustained heat and smoke, appear in these records with notable frequency. The specific compounds involved were not understood germ theory, and modern toxicology was centuries away, but the pattern was observed. People who worked in chandleries for many years tended to develop persistent coughs, breathing difficulties, and a general decline in health that contemporaries connected, if imprecisely, to the nature of their work. This is an aspect of the chandler's life that almost never appears in the histories because it was not dramatic in the way that a workshop fire was dramatic. It was slow, it was chronic, it was the kind of harm that accumulates quietly over decades, rather than arriving in a single catastrophic moment, and it fell, as these things usually do, most heavily on the people at the bottom of the craft hierarchy, the apprentices and journeymen who spent the most time in direct contact with the rendering vats, who had the least ability to step outside for fresh air, and who had no recourse when their health declined. I want to name that because I think it matters. The light that kept European civilization functioning through its long nights had a human cost built into it, a cost that was paid specifically by the people who had the least power to refuse. And yet, even knowing all of this, the smell, the danger, the health toll, the municipal bans, the complicated politics of guild membership and city regulation, what strikes me most forcefully when I look at the history of chandlery is not the difficulty of it, it is the persistence of it. The fact that across centuries, through plague and war and economic collapse and political upheaval, there were always people willing to do this work. to show up at the vat every morning, light the fire, and spend the day making the thing that everyone needed but nobody wanted to think about. There is a specific kind of dignity in that. Not the dignity of glory or recognition, the dignity of necessity, of being the person who does the hard thing because someone has to. And interestingly, the story of where candle making happened, not in the city centres, not in the grand market squares, but in the margins, in the spaces between the butcher and the tanner and the edge of the city wall, that geography had consequences that nobody planned for, and that I find absolutely fascinating to trace. Because pushed to the margins of the secular city, candle making found a second home in a world that was neither marginal nor ignored, a world of stone walls and beehives and bells rung at fixed hours, a world that more than any noble household or merchant guild would shape the trajectory of the craft in ways that echoed for centuries. The monasteries were about to enter this story, and when they did, everything changed. Pushed to the edges of cities regulated, taxed, complained about and occasionally banned, the tallow chandler's trade had a complicated relationship with the secular urban world. But there was another world entirely where candle making happened, a world with no guild wardens, no municipal ordinances about smell, no price disputes with unhappy customers. A world where the making of candles was not a commercial transaction but a sacred duty. And a world that over several centuries quietly became the most sophisticated and productive candle-making operation in all of a pre-industrial Europe. The monastery. I want to take you inside the walls for a while, because I think most people, when they think about medieval monasteries at all, picture a place of quiet prayer, manuscript, illumination, perhaps some gardening. All of that is true. But the monastery was also in its organized and disciplined way a factory, a food production facility, a pharmaceutical laboratory, a school, a hospital, and crucially for our story tonight, a candle-making operation of considerable scale and sophistication. To understand why you need to understand something about how monastic life was structured, and specifically about the Rule of St. Benedict, the foundational document of Benedictine monasticism that shaped the organization of hundreds of monasteries across Europe from the 6th century onward. The Rule is a surprisingly practical document. It is not primarily a mystical text, it is a manual for running a community. And running a community, according to Benedict, meant organizing every hour of every day around a balance of prayer, work and study. Nothing was left to chance. Nothing was left to individual preference. The monastery ran like a clock, and as we will discuss more fully in our next section, the candle was often what made that clock work. But here is the relevant point, for right now the rule required light, not metaphorically, literally. The canonical hours, those 8 fixed prayer times distributed across the day and night, required the entire community to gather in the chapel regardless of the hour or the season. Matins was prayed in the middle of the night. Lauds came before dawn. The monks did not sleep through winter mornings and simply catch up on prayer when the sun came up. They rose in the dark, and they needed light to do it. This meant that a monastery's demand for candles was not occasional or ceremonial. It was continuous, daily and substantial. A medium-sized Benedictine monastery housing 30 to 50 monks would burn candles in the chapel through the night offices in the scriptorium, where manuscripts were copied in the refectory during meals, when the light was poor in the infirmary, where the sick needed consistent care, and in the private cells of senior monks for their reading and writing. The volume of candles required to sustain this level of activity day after day, year after year, was considerable, and buying them all from outside was expensive. The solution was obvious and practical: make your own. And making your own candles, if you were a Benedictine monastery of any size, meant keeping bees, not a few hives in a corner of the garden as a hobby. serious organized apiculture as a core element of the monastery's economic and liturgical life. The monastery apiary was typically located in the kitchen garden, or a dedicated section of the walled grounds positioned to give the bees access to the monastery's own plantings while remaining close enough to the chandlery building for easy transfer of harvested wax. The monks who tended the bees, and this was a specific assigned role within the monastery's labour structure, not something everyone did, developed deep expertise in bee management. They understood the seasonal rhythms of the hive, the signs of a healthy colony, the timing of honey harvest, the techniques for extracting wax without damaging the hive's capacity for the following year. And here is the detail that I think most perfectly captures the medieval monastic relationship with beeswax. The honey and the wax were never entirely separable in the monastic imagination. They came from the same source. They served related purposes. The honey fed the community, the wax lit its prayers. Both were products of the same organized, disciplined, collectively produced effort. And the monks, who spent a great deal of time thinking about symbolic correspondences between the natural and the sacred, found in the beehive a perfect mirror of their own community. The hive was organized, the workers were celibate, the community produced sweetness and light through disciplined labor. The theological resonance was irresistible. There is a remarkable document from the Monastery of St. Gall in what is now Switzerland, one of the best preserved examples of medieval monastic planning that we have, dating from around the year 820. It is a detailed architectural plan showing how the ideal monastery should be organized room by room and building by building, and among the kitchen gardens, the fish ponds, the cemetery, the hospital, and the scriptorium. The plan includes a specific apiary with 9 labelled beehive positions and a dedicated building for wax processing. The architect of the ideal monastery in the 9th century considered the bee yard as essential to the physical plan as the church itself. That is not a small detail. That is a statement about how central candle production was to the functioning of the whole enterprise. Now let me walk you through what actually happened in the monastic chandlery, because the process in a monastery was meaningfully different from what was happening in the commercial urban workshops we've been discussing. The wax was harvested after the honey had been extracted from the combs. The empty combs were melted down, the wax separated from the small amount of remaining honey, and the other organic matter in the comb and the raw wax was refined through a process of boiling and filtering, sometimes done several times, with seawater used as a purifying agent in some documented monastic traditions, which help draw out impurities and produce a paler, cleaner final product. The colour of the finished wax mattered. The purest, whitest beeswax was considered the most sacred, and monasteries that supplied candles to major cathedrals or to royal patrons were expected to provide wax of the highest possible clarity. The refined wax was then poured into moulds or used for dipping in the chandlery, where designated monks worked under the supervision of a senior brother responsible for candle production. The scale of this operation in a large monastery could be genuinely impressive. The monastery of Cluny in Burgundy, which at its height in the 11th and 12th centuries was the largest and most influential monastery in Europe, housing several hundred monks and acting as the centre of a network of over 1,000 affiliated houses, maintained candle production at a scale that supplied not only its own enormous daily demand, but also exported surplus wax and finished candles to affiliated houses and to major church patrons. Cluny's chandlery was not a cottage craft. It was an institutional production facility of real economic significance. And this economic dimension is something I want to stay with for a moment, because it tends to get overlooked in the standard narratives about monastic life. Monasteries, for all their spiritual purpose, were economic actors. They owned land, they produced goods, they traded. And beeswax was one of the most consistently valuable commodities in the medieval European economy. It could be stored. It travelled without spoiling. It was always in demand from churches' noble households and the growing urban merchant class who could afford it. A monastery with a well-managed apiary and an efficient chandlery was sitting on a reliable recurring source of income that could supplement its income from agriculture and from the donations of patrons. The Cistercian monasteries, a reform movement within Benedictine monasticism that began in the 12th century and spread rapidly across Europe, were particularly notable for the efficiency of their economic operations. The Cistercians placed a strong emphasis on manual labour and on the systematic organisation of monastic agriculture and craft production. Cistercian beekeeping and wax production were by the standards of the era highly organised and remarkably productive. They developed techniques for expanding their apiaries, for managing multiple hive types, for timing harvests, to maximise both honey and wax yield. The economics of their candle production were not incidental to their monastic life. They were embedded in it, supported by the same organisational discipline that governed every other aspect of how they lived. There is a record from the English Cistercian monastery of Rievaulx in Yorkshire, founded in 1132, that documents the monastery's production and trade in wax candles as part of its broader economic activity. Rievaulx was operating in the context of a booming medieval English economy, and its candle production was integrated into regional trade networks that connected it to markets far beyond its immediate area. The monastery was in this dimension of its life a commercial enterprise operating with sophisticated organisational capacity. Now I want to pause here and ask you something that I think is genuinely worth thinking about. When we picture the relationship between religion and commerce in the medieval period, we tend to imagine them in tension, the spiritual world on one side, the marketplace on the other, the church, periodically and not always successfully trying to hold the two apart, and that tension was real. But the monastery's candle economy shows us something more complicated and more interesting, a case where the spiritual requirement you need beeswax candles for the altar. No substitutions acceptable drove the development of sophisticated productive capacity. The theology created the economics. The religious demand built the industry. The requirement that only beeswax could be used for sacred purposes was not just a preference or a tradition. It was in effect a protected market. Every church in Europe, every cathedral, every parish, every monastic house, all of them locked into beeswax by theological requirement, represented a guaranteed inelastic demand for a product that monasteries were unusually well positioned to supply. The Pope's decree about altar candles was, among its many other effects, an extraordinary piece of economic protectionism for the beeswax trade. Whether anyone planned it that way is another question. The outcome was the same, and this created a feedback loop that built itself over several centuries. Monasteries needed beeswax for their own liturgical use, which drove them to develop beekeeping expertise, which generated surplus wax which they sold to other churches and to secular customers, which generated income, which supported the monastery's other activities, which included training more monks in the relevant skills which produced more high-quality wax, and so on. The monastic chandlery was not an isolated craft operation. It was a node in a self-reinforcing economic and spiritual system that sustained itself across generations. One more detail before we move on, because it touches something that I think is genuinely beautiful. The monks who worked in the chandlery, who spent their days melting wax and dipping wicks and refining and filtering and testing and storing, were doing this work within the same daily framework of prayer and silence and collective life that governed everything else in the monastery. They were not stepping outside the religious context to do commercial work. The chandlery was not a factory in a spiritual place. It was part of the spiritual place. The work of making candles was understood within the Benedictine framework as a form of prayer in itself. Ora et labora, pray and work, was the foundational principle. The monk dipping wicks in the morning before the office of terce was not taking a break from his religious life, he was living it. I find something genuinely moving about that framing. The idea that the most ordinary physical, repetitive, slightly smelly work of making candles could be understood as spiritually equivalent to kneeling in the chapel. That the labour of the hands and the labour of the spirit were not in competition, but in a continuous flowing relationship with each other. The candles that went from the monastic chandlery to the altar were not just products. They were the end of a process that had begun in the same spirit of attention and dedication that the monks brought to their prayers. And when you lit one of those candles in a cathedral at a private altar, in the flickering darkness of a church you'd walked into from the cold, you were in some very small way connected to all of that. To the bees and the garden and the monk who tended them and the chandlery where the wax was refined, and the hands that shaped the candle and the discipline and the silence and the prayer that surrounded all of it from beginning to end. That is a kind of meaning that a tallow candle for all its practical value simply could not carry, which brings us quite naturally to the craft itself, the specific physical day-by-day practice of making these candles in monasteries and workshops and farmhouse kitchens across Europe. Because now that we understand who was making candles and why, and what materials they were using, it is time to understand how, in the most precise, hands-on, technically interesting sense of that word. The dipping frame is waiting, the tallow is at temperature, and the answer to why making a good candle was genuinely harder than it looks is something I cannot wait to show you. Close your eyes for a second. Well, not literally, because then you cannot keep listening, but in your mind, close them. Picture a workshop in the early morning, somewhere in France, let's say sometime in the 15th century. The air is cool, deliberately cool, because you need it that way. A long wooden frame stretches across the centre of the room, hung with rows of twisted linen threads, each one dangling straight and still. Against the far wall a fire burns low and steady beneath a wide, shallow vat. The fat inside is just beginning to liquefy. You can see it at the edges, first a slow, transparent ring spreading inward from the sides. The chandler stands at the frame watching the vat, not the wicks, because the wicks are ready, the fat is not yet. This is the moment before the work begins, and the work once it begins will not stop for hours. What I want to do in this part of our story is something I've been looking forward to for a while, getting into the actual physical reality of how a candle was made. Not the chemistry, not the economics, not the guild politics, the hands, the motion, the specific decisions that a craftsman made 50 times an hour all day for years that determined whether the candle you burned that night was going to give you clean, steady light or gutter and smoke and make your eyes water. Because here is what I genuinely believe: the making of a pre-industrial candle was a craft in the truest sense. It required skill that was invisible until you lacked it. It required judgment that came only from sustained practice. And it required a particular quality of attention, patient, continuous, almost meditative, that is almost entirely foreign to the way most of us work today. Let's start with the wick. Because the wick was where everything began, and the wick was for most of candle-making history far more important and far more complicated than it looked. In the pre-industrial period, candle wicks were made from natural plant fibres. Linen was common linen thread twisted into a loose, slightly irregular rope of varying thickness, depending on the size of the candle being made. Hemp was also used particularly for heavier candles that needed to sustain a larger flame. In some regions and periods, cotton was available, though it was more expensive and less universal in Europe until later. The key quality you wanted in a wick fibre was absorbency, the ability to draw melted fat upward through capillary action to feed the flame. Too tight a twist and the fat could not travel up efficiently. Too loose and the wick would collapse in on itself when the surrounding wax softened. The preparation of wicks was its own skill, separate from the dipping itself, and in busy professional workshops, it was often the work assigned to apprentices in their earliest years. Now the dipping. The chandler would take the prepared wicks hung evenly from a wooden rod or frame that allowed multiple wicks to be dipped simultaneously and lower them into the vat of melted fat, slowly, evenly, with the rod held level so that all the wicks entered the fat at the same moment and to the same depth. This mattered more than it sounds. An uneven dip meant an uneven coating, and an uneven coating meant a candle that would burn asymmetrically the thicker side, sustaining the flame longer than the thinner side, causing the whole candle to tilt and drip and eventually fail. The wick would stay in the fat for just a moment, not long enough for the previous layers to melt off, but long enough for the new layer to adhere, then up out and held in the cool air to solidify. This cooling was not passive. An experienced chandler would walk the length of the frame watching each candle as it cooled, sometimes gently straightening any that were developing a lean, pressing them lightly back to true while the fat was still just soft enough to accept the correction. Then down again. Another dip, another wait, another inspection. 15 dips to build a candle of minimal useful thickness, 20 to 25 for a standard household candle, 30 or more for the larger premium candles destined for wealthy households or church use. Do the arithmetic. If you're dipping a frame of 50 wicks simultaneously, which was typical in a productive workshop, and each dip and cool cycle takes roughly 3 to 4 minutes, you're looking at somewhere between 1 and 2 hours of continuous dipping just to build a single batch of candles to useful thickness. And then you had to do the next batch, and the one after that. The physical repetition of this work was not the grinding, mindless repetition of, say, shoveling gravel. It was more demanding than that and more subtle. Every dip required a judgment call: is the fat at the right temperature? Has the previous layer cooled sufficiently? Is this particular candle developing unevenly? Do I need to adjust the angle of the frame? These were not questions you answered consciously every time. After years of practice, they became something more like instinct, a continuous low-level monitoring of dozens of variables simultaneously. And this is where the temperature question becomes genuinely fascinating. A chandler in the 14th or 15th century had no thermometer, none. The thermometer as a measuring instrument was not developed until the 17th century, and reliable standardized thermometers for practical use came even later. So how did a chandler know when his tallow was at the right temperature for dipping? How did he know when it was too hot enough that the previous layers would melt back off, or too cool solid enough that it would not adhere properly to the wick? He knew because he knew. Through years of watching fat melt, through the specific way the surface moved when you disturbed it with a stick, the viscosity, the shimmer, the behavior of the film at the edges, through the sound of the fat in the vat, the difference between a quiet even liquidity and the first beginning bubbles that told you the temperature was climbing toward dangerous, through the feel of the air above the vat on the backs of his hands, through the behavior of a test dip on a spare piece of wick, watching how the fat clung, how quickly it set, how opaque it became as it cooled. This knowledge was not written down. It could not really be written down, not in any way that would actually transfer it to someone who had not stood at a vat for months. It was the kind of knowledge that lives in the body, in the eyes, the hands, the nose, the accumulated memory of 10,000 small observations. This is what the 7-year apprenticeship was actually for. Not to learn the theory of candle making, to accumulate enough experience that your body could make the right decisions automatically without having to think through each one from first principles. I find something almost profound about that. We live in an era that is deeply committed to making knowledge explicit, to writing things down, to creating procedures and manuals and training programs that can transfer skill efficiently from one person to another. And there is real value in that. But there is a category of knowledge that this approach cannot fully capture, knowledge that only becomes real when your hands have done the thing enough times. The chandler's knowledge of temperature was that kind, and it took years. Can I ask you something? Is there something in your own life, some skill, some practice, some judgment call you make regularly, where you have come to trust your instincts in a way that you cannot entirely explain to someone else? Where experience has become something more like a second sense? I think most people, if they are honest, have at least one of those things, and I think recognizing that puts us in a different relationship with the craftsmen of the past, not looking down at them from a superior technological height, but recognizing something genuinely shared in the experience of learning a difficult thing slowly and deeply. Now, there is a development in the technical history of candle making that changed the craft significantly, and that tends to get dated to the 14th century, which is the introduction of the mould. The shift from dipped candles to moulded candles. The mould technique was in principle straightforward. Instead of building up a candle layer by layer through repeated dipping, you suspended a wick inside a pre-formed cavity, typically made from metal or sometimes from clay or wood, sealed against leaking, and poured the melted fat around it. The fat cooled and solidified in the shape of the mould. You extracted the finished candle and you had a product of consistent shape and size every time. The advantages were real. Moulded candles could be produced with much greater dimensional consistency than dipped ones. If you needed candles of a specific length and diameter for a particular use, say, to fit a specific style of candlestick or to burn for a specific number of hours in a specific ceremony, the mould gave you a level of control that dipping could not easily match. And from a purely aesthetic standpoint, a cleanly moulded candle was smoother and more uniform than a dipped one, whose surface often retained the subtle irregularities of the layering process. But the mould also had limitations that kept it from immediately displacing the dip technique in most workshops. The most practical one, you could only produce one candle per mould per cycle. You poured, you waited for the fat to solidify fully. You extracted the candle, you cleaned the mould, you rethreaded the wick, and you started again. For a small workshop producing a modest quantity of candles, this was manageable. For a high-volume commercial operation trying to supply hundreds or thousands of candles a week, the mould was far less efficient than a dipping frame that could handle 50 or 100 wicks simultaneously. The result was that dipping and moulding coexisted for centuries, used for different purposes in different contexts by different types of producers. Professional chandlers in high-volume urban workshops tended to favour the dipping method for bulk production. Monasteries and noble households where a smaller quantity of higher quality candles was needed might rely more heavily on moulds. Rural household candle making, which we will come back to, often used whichever method was most practical given what materials were available. There is another physical aspect of dipped candle production that I want to give you, because it completes the picture in a way that nothing else quite does. The cooling. The inevitable, patient, non-negotiable waiting for the fat to solidify between dips. In a warm workshop, and workshop temperatures were not always easy to control, particularly in summer. The cooling time between dips could be frustratingly long. Fat that cooled slowly meant candles that were built up slowly, which meant fewer candles per day, which meant lower output, which meant less income. Professional chandlers learned to manage their workshop temperature with care. Cool air was an asset. A drafty room, which would have been a misery for anyone trying to stay warm, was actually useful during the candle dipping process. Some records suggest that chandlers would open shutters and doors during dipping to encourage airflow and speed the cooling of their candles, then close everything again when the rendering vats needed to maintain temperature. In winter, this balance shifted. The cold air made cooling fast, almost too fast in extreme temperatures, because fat that solidified too quickly would not adhere evenly to the layers beneath it, producing candles that cracked or shed their outer layers when handled. Summer was slow and soft and difficult. Winter was brittle and fast and required its own management. Every season brought a different set of problems, a different calibration of the same basic process. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, the dipping and the waiting and the adjusting and the inspecting and the correcting and the starting again, there was a person, not a machine, not an automated process. A person standing in a room that smelled strongly of what it was, making small decisions continuously for hours, building light one thin layer at a time. When I sit with that image long enough, it stops feeling like a description of a historical craft and starts feeling like a description of a kind of care, a sustained physical, daily attention to the needs of other people, people who needed light, who could not make it themselves, who would burn these candles without a single thought for what went into them. Most of them never knew the chandler's name. Most of them never thought about the dipping frame or the cooling air or the temperature judgment that went into what they were burning. They just lit the wick and got on with their evening, which I suppose is the fate of all truly essential work. It disappears into its own usefulness. But the candle itself, the finished object sitting on the table waiting to be lit, carried that care inside it. In the evenness of its surface, in the straightness of its wick, in the steady clean burn that a well-made candle gave and a poorly made one did not. And that brings us almost naturally to something that has been quietly waiting in the background of this whole story, a question about the wick itself that I think is one of the most underappreciated puzzles in the entire history of this craft. Because the wick, as simple as it looks, was not a solved problem for most of pre-industrial history. It was an ongoing, frustrating daily challenge that every chandler and every candle user had to manage constantly. And the story of why and what eventually changed it is stranger and more interesting than almost anyone expects. Right, the wick. I promised you at the end of our last section that this was stranger and more interesting than you expected. I want to make good on that promise because the wick is one of these subjects that sounds on the surface almost comically minor. It is a piece of twisted fibre. It sits inside a candle. The candle burns. What is there to say? Quite a lot, as it turns out. Enough, actually, that I've been saving it deliberately because the wick problem, the specific, persistent, maddening problem of how to make a wick that behaves properly, is a thread that runs through the entire history of pre-industrial candle making and connects to one of the most quietly significant small inventions of the early 19th century. An invention so simple and so effective that we still use it today completely without thinking about it every time we light a candle. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the beginning. The function of a wick in basic terms is to transport melted fuel from the body of the candle upward to the flame. This happens through capillary action, the same physical phenomenon that allows a paper towel to absorb water, or a plant to draw moisture from the soil up through its stem. The melted wax or tallow liquefied by the heat of the burning flame above is drawn upward through the spaces between the fibres of the wick. When it reaches the top of the wick, it vaporizes in the heat of the flame and burns. The flame sustains itself as long as there is fuel to draw up and a wick to carry it. In theory, this is elegant. In practice, in pre-industrial candle making, it was an ongoing source of frustration. The core problem was this. The wick fibre did not burn away cleanly, not with the materials available to pre-industrial chandlers. Twisted linen, hemp, cotton, where available, and in some earlier periods fibres from rushes or oakum, which was a loose fibre made from old rope. These fibres burned, but they burned incompletely. As the candle burned down over the course of an evening, the wick above the flame zone, the part that had already been consumed and was no longer drawing up fuel, did not simply disappear, it continued to smoulder. It formed a charred, carbonized stub that curled over at the tip and gradually grew longer as the evening progressed. This charred stub, if left unmanaged, caused serious problems. A wick with too long a char would begin to smoke, producing that familiar thin black column that made tallow candles especially unpleasant in enclosed spaces. The flame would become uneven and guttering, drawing more fuel than it could cleanly combust, creating a pool of liquid wax or tallow around the base that would drip and run. In the worst cases, a severely neglected wick would produce what candle users of the era called a thief in the candle, an accumulation of molten fuel on one side of the wick that burned unevenly, consuming the candle much faster on one side than the other, and producing enormous amounts of smoke and soot in the process. The solution to all of this was snuffing, and the snuffer, that small metal tool that looks like a pair of scissors with a little box attached to one blade, was one of the most important household objects in pre-industrial Europe. Not decorative, not ceremonial, essential. To snuff a candle properly, you did not blow it out. Blowing a candle out and relighting it was wasteful and inconvenient, and the smoke produced when a flame was suddenly extinguished was considerable. Instead, you used the snuffer to clip the excess char from the top of the wick, the part that was no longer drawing fuel efficiently and was producing the smoke and the uneven flame. You cut it cleanly at the right length, not too short, because a wick cut too close to the wax pool would drown in its own fuel and extinguish itself, but not too long, because too long a wick was the source of the original problem. The clipped char went into the little box on the snuffer blade safely contained, so it did not fall as a glowing ember onto the tablecloth or the rushes on the floor. Done well, snuffing transformed the quality of a candle flame almost instantly. A guttering, smoky, uneven flame, snuffed at the right moment, would settle immediately into a clean, tall, steady burn. The difference was striking enough that experienced households of the period knew to snuff their candles at regular intervals throughout the evening, roughly every hour for a tallow candle, somewhat less frequently for beeswax, which burned more completely and required less frequent attention. This meant that tending candles was itself a skill. Not a dramatic skill, not the kind of skill you apprentice for 7 years to learn, but a real form of domestic knowledge that was passed from one generation to the next. Children in pre-industrial European households learned to snuff candles as a routine evening task. Servants in wealthy households were explicitly responsible for candle management, lighting them at the right time, trimming them at the right intervals, replacing them before they burned too low, extinguishing them safely at the end of the evening. In great houses there was often a specific servant, whose responsibilities included the care and management of lighting. In France, this position had an official name, the bourgeois, from the word for candle holder, and managing the household's candles was considered skilled domestic work. Now here is where the history gets genuinely interesting from a technological standpoint. For most of pre-industrial history, everybody knew that candles needed snuffing. Everybody dealt with it. Everybody developed their own routines and tools for managing it. And for about as long as candles existed, nobody seriously tried to engineer the problem away to design a wick that simply did not produce the charred stub in the first place. The reason nobody tried was partly practical and partly conceptual. Practically, the materials available for wicks, linen, hemp, cotton, all behaved in essentially the same way when exposed to sustained heat. They burned incompletely and left char. There was no obviously better alternative within the fibre technology of the time. Conceptually, the snuffing routine had become so embedded in how people interacted with candles that it was no longer perceived as a problem to be solved. It was simply how candles worked. You snuffed them. This was understood. It took a shift in conceptual perspective, and specifically it took the development of a new way of preparing the wick fibre to finally crack the problem. And when it happened in France in the early 19th century, in the context of the same wave of chemical and manufacturing innovation that was transforming so many other aspects of the candle trade. The breakthrough was the braided wick. specifically a wick prepared by braiding or plaiting the fibres in a particular way, rather than simply twisting them and then treating the finished wick with a specific preparation of weak acid or salt solution before it was used. The combination of the braided structure and the chemical treatment caused the wick as it burned to curl consistently in one direction, and that curl bent the tip of the burning wick outside the main zone of the flame, where the higher temperature of the outer flame region caused it to combust completely and cleanly. No stub, no char accumulation, no smoke, no need to snuff. The self-consuming wick, patented in France in the 1820s and refined over the following decades, was one of those inventions that looks almost absurdly simple in retrospect. A braid and a chemical soak. That is all. But the practical effect was transformative. Candles that used the new wick technology burned cleaner, longer, and more consistently than anything previously available. They required no snuffing. They could be lit and left. The entire ritual of wick management, the snuffer, the trimming, the trained servant, the domestic expertise of knowing when to cut and how short became, within the span of a single generation, unnecessary. The snuffer, which had been a standard item in every household of any means for centuries, began its long decline into the category of antique curiosity. You can still find them today in antique shops and estate sales. Those small scissors with the box on one blade, and most people who pick them up have no idea what they were for. They look decorative, they feel purposeful, but the purpose they served is so completely obsolete that it has become invisible. I find that specific kind of obsolescence, the object whose function we have so thoroughly forgotten that we cannot even identify it from its shape, one of the more haunting things about material history. The snuffer is a perfect example. It was in constant daily use in nearly every home in Europe for at least 500 years. And then it wasn't. And within a generation or two, the knowledge of what it was for had essentially vanished from common understanding. But let me go back to the pre-snuffer era for a moment, because there are a few more dimensions of the wick story that I want to give you before we move on. The thickness of the wick relative to the diameter of the candle was a critical variable that experienced chandlers understood deeply, even if they could not have expressed it in the terms a modern chemist would use. A wick that was too thin for the candle diameter would not draw up enough fuel to sustain the flame, producing a weak guttering light and excessive dripping as the unburned wax pooled around the wick. A wick that was too thick would draw up more fuel than the flame could combust cleanly, producing a large, smoky, unstable flame that burned the candle down too quickly and filled the room with soot. The correct wick-to-candle ratio was not written in any manual. It was learned through experience, through the specific embodied knowledge of a chandler who had made thousands of candles and knew from the behavior of the flame during testing whether a batch of candles would perform well or poorly in use. Getting the wick right was a core part of what separated a good chandler from a mediocre one. A candle that burned badly was not just aesthetically unpleasant, it was economically wasteful. It burned faster than it should, it produced less usable light per inch of candle, and it created the smoke and soot that darkened walls and irritated eyes and made indoor air quality worse than it already was in a sealed medieval room. The wick was also the element of candle making most sensitive to moisture. Linen and hemp fibre, if stored in damp conditions, would absorb water that could not be fully expelled even through the dipping process. A candle made from a slightly damp wick would be noticeably harder to light, would produce more smoke when it did finally catch, and would burn with characteristic spitting and crackling as the residual moisture vaporized. Experienced chandlers stored their prepared wicks carefully in dry conditions away from the floor, ideally in sealed containers, and tested new supplies before committing them to large production runs. Does any of this, the careful attention to small variables, the embodied knowledge of what good performance looks like before you can measure it, Precisely the awareness of how one small element affects the entire system. Does any of this remind you of something in your own life? Because it reminds me every time I think about it of baking, of the way experienced bakers know from the feel of dough whether it needs more flour or more water long before any scale or recipe could tell them. The knowledge lives in the hands. The testing happens through sensation rather than measurement. And the result, the candle that burns cleanly all evening, the bread that rises exactly right, looks effortless to anyone who did not see the years of practice that made it possible. Now, there is one final aspect of the wick that I want to mention, because it connects this section of our story to a much larger question about how technology actually changes things in human life. The self-consuming wick, when it arrived in the 1820s and spread through the candle trade over the following decades, did not just make candles more convenient. It changed the relationship between people and candles in a way that was real, but almost impossible to measure. Because for centuries the need to tend candles, to snuff them, to watch them, to stay present with them, had been a form of engagement with light. You could not simply light a candle and ignore it. You had to pay attention to it. You had to be in some kind of ongoing relationship with the flame throughout the evening. The self-consuming wick removed that obligation. You could light the candle and do something else, and trust that it would take care of itself, which was convenient, which was better in practical terms in almost every way, but something was also lost. Some small habitual quality of attention, of being present with the source of your light of the evening, organized partly around the needs of the flame rather than entirely around your own preferences. We removed the last friction between ourselves and light, and friction, it turns out, has a way of keeping you present. The next chapter of our story is about something that might seem unrelated at first, but which I promise connects to everything we've been discussing in a way that surprised even me when I first worked it out. It is about time. About the strange, almost accidental way that the candle became one of the most important timekeeping devices in the history of European civilization. And about what it means that the instrument that measured time for kings and monks and entire communities was the same small, imperfect wick and wax object that ordinary people were snuffing every hour of every evening in their homes. The candle knew what time it was, and the story of how that happened is one I have been looking forward to for a long time. Of all the things a candle could do, light a room, signal wealth, honour the sacred guide, a traveller down a dark road, there is one function that almost nobody thinks about today, and that I consider one of the most quietly revolutionary things in this entire story. A candle could tell you what time it was, not approximately, not roughly, with a precision that for its era was genuinely remarkable. And the story of how light became a clock, and what happened to the way people experienced their days once it did, is one I have been holding in reserve because I wanted to get here slowly with enough context to appreciate just how strange and significant it really is. Let me start with a king. Alfred, King of Wessex in southern England, who ruled from 871 to 899, is one of those historical figures who tends to get reduced to a single story. Most people who know anything about him know the one about the cakes. The legend almost certainly not literally true, though it captures something real about Alfred's character, in which he's hiding from his enemies, sheltering with a peasant woman, and she asks him to watch her cakes baking by the fire. He gets distracted thinking about his kingdom's problems. The cakes burn and she scolds him without knowing who he is. It is a charming story. It has survived because it makes Alfred feel human, fallible, present in the ordinary world in a way that most kings of the period were not. But the thing about Alfred that I find genuinely extraordinary, and that connects directly to our story tonight, is not the cakes. It is his candles. Alfred was, by the standards of 9th century English kingship, an unusual man. He was deeply interested in learning in the organisation of time, in the rational management of his own days and the days of his court. He had been ill for much of his adult life. Historians have debated the nature of his condition for centuries, with various suggestions ranging from Crohn's disease to a stress-related disorder, and this experience of physical limitation seems to have sharpened his attention to how time was used. A man who knows he may not have as much time as he would like tends to think carefully about what he does with the time he has. Alfred, according to his biographer Asser, a Welsh monk who knew him personally and wrote a detailed account of his life, wanted to divide each 24-hour day into 3 equal portions: 8 hours for prayer and study, 8 hours for the business of governing, 8 hours for sleep and rest. Not a radical idea in theory. In practice, in 9th century England, it was almost impossible to implement, because how do you measure 8 hours? The sun can give you a rough approximation during the day with shadows and the arc across the sky. But at night, in overcast weather, in a room without windows, you cannot. So Alfred used candles. Specifically, and this is where it becomes fascinating, he used candles of a standardized size marked at intervals burned in a lantern with translucent horn panels to protect the flame from drafts. Each candle was made to a consistent length and a consistent thickness so that it would burn at a predictable, consistent rate. The lantern shielded the flame from the variable air currents that would otherwise cause the burn rate to fluctuate unpredictably, and Alfred or his attendants would check the position of the flame against the marks on the candle to know how much of the current time portion had elapsed. This was not a casual experiment. This was a deliberate engineered timekeeping system built around the specific properties of a burning candle. Alfred reportedly used 6 candles per day, each burning for 4 hours to track his 24-hour schedule. He is, as far as historical records tell us, one of the earliest documented users of what we now call a candle clock in the Western tradition. Now, I want to be honest here because intellectual honesty matters to me more than a clean narrative. The historical evidence for the specific details of Alfred's candle clock comes primarily from Asser, and Asser was writing a biography designed to present Alfred in the most favourable light possible. Some of the details may be embellished, as biographical accounts of powerful patrons often were, but the core of it, that Alfred used candles as timekeeping devices and was deliberate about structuring his day, is consistent with everything else we know about how he governed and how he thought, and the technology itself was real and practical. Whether every detail is precisely accurate is less important than what the story tells us about the relationship between candles and time in this period. Because Alfred's candle clock was not an isolated quirk, it was an early documented example of something that was happening across medieval European society on a much larger scale: the use of candles to measure structure and discipline time. The monasteries, which we touched on in an earlier part of our story, were in many ways the laboratories of medieval time management. The monastic day was organised around what were called the canonical hours, a set of fixed prayer times distributed across the day and night. Matins in the middle of the night, lauds at dawn, prime at the first hour, terce sext, nun morning, midday, mid-afternoon, vespers at evening, compline before sleep, 8 scheduled moments of collective prayer, each requiring the entire community of monks to stop what they were doing and gather in the chapel. To keep these hours consistently to ensure that the community prayed at the same time each day regardless of season or weather, or how absorbed they were in their work, the monks needed timekeeping. And for most of the early and central medieval period, before mechanical clocks became reliable enough for widespread use, candles were a primary timekeeping tool in monastic life. The monks used what were called hour candles calibrated to burn for a specific period marked at intervals maintained by a designated brother, whose responsibility was to monitor the flame and ring the bell at the appointed times. The accuracy of this system depended entirely on the quality and consistency of the candles. A candle that burned faster than expected would cause the community to pray too early. One that burned too slowly would delay the office. The monk responsible for timekeeping a position called the sacristan in many monasteries was therefore also responsible for ensuring that the candles used for this purpose were made to a consistent standard. He was in a very real sense the community's timekeeper, and the candle was his instrument. Here is what I find remarkable about this. When you think about it carefully, the canonical hours were not just a religious practice, they were a technology of social coordination. 8 times a day, an entire community of people stopped their individual activities and came together in a shared moment. That required synchronized time. And synchronized time in the 9th and 10th and 11th centuries required light. Specifically, it required a flame that burned at a predictable rate. The candle was doing something that we have entirely outsourced to machines. It was organizing human society and time, and this had consequences that extended far beyond the monastery walls. Because the canonical hours rung by the monastery bell were often the primary public timekeeping system for the towns and villages in the surrounding area. The monks rang their bell at terce, and the farmers in the fields nearby knew it was mid-morning. They rang at sext, and the market in the square shifted from the morning goods to the afternoon business. They rang at vespers, and the craftsmen in the workshops began thinking about finishing for the day. The rhythm of the monastic candle that carefully calibrated standardized burn organized not just the community of monks, but the entire temporal structure of the surrounding civilian world. The word noon, which we use to mean 12 o'clock midday, actually derives from the canonical hour called none, which was originally the 9th hour of the day, roughly 3 in the afternoon by modern reckoning. Over time, in various parts of medieval Europe, the none prayer gradually shifted earlier in the day, eventually landing around what we would call 12 o'clock, and noon came with it. Our word for the middle of the day is a linguistic fossil of the medieval monastic schedule, which was kept for centuries by candles. I love that kind of thing. The way the past hides in plain sight inside the words we use without thinking. Now let me shift the perspective slightly, because the time measurement story has another dimension that I think is even more interesting from a social history standpoint. And that is the question of what happens to a society's relationship with productivity and daily rhythm when it gains the ability to measure time precisely after dark. Before reliable artificial timekeeping, before the candle clock, and descendants' night time was in a meaningful sense outside of time. You knew roughly when sunset was. You knew roughly when dawn would come. But the hours in between were largely undifferentiated. They were just dark. Sleep happened, waking happened, things happened in the night. But they were not scheduled, they were not measured, they were not accountable to a clock. The introduction of the candle as a timekeeping device changed this gradually and unevenly but genuinely. If you could measure the night, you could organize the night. You could assign tasks to specific hours. You could hold people accountable for how they spent their time after dark. You could distinguish in a new and more precise way between the time you had used well and the time you had wasted. This sounds like pure progress, and in many ways it was. But it also introduced something that had not existed in quite the same way before the anxiety of measured time. The feeling that the hours were passing at a rate you could now observe, and that therefore you were obligated to account for them. The monk with his candle clock rising in the cold dark for matins was not just performing a religious duty. He was participating in a new relationship between human beings, and time itself a relationship in which time was no longer a flowing ambient presence, but a series of measurable units, each one potentially well used or poorly used, each one theoretically accountable to God and to the community. This anxiety about time, does this sound familiar to you? The feeling that you should be doing something with every hour. The sense that idle time is somehow wrong, somehow wasteful, somehow a small moral failure. I'm not saying that candles invented this feeling, but I'm saying that the ability to measure time precisely, especially after dark, created the conditions in which that feeling could become systematic, could become embedded in how institutions and eventually individuals organized themselves. The Benedictine monastic tradition, which shaped so much of medieval European culture, ran explicitly on the principle that idleness was the enemy of the soul. Every hour of the day was to be filled with prayer work or study. The candle that measured those hours was not neutral. It was a tool in the service of a particular vision of what a human life should look like, structured, accountable, continuous in its purpose. And I think it is worth sitting with the question of how much of that vision we have inherited without fully choosing it. When you feel guilty about an afternoon spent doing nothing productive when you describe leisure as something you have to earn, where does that instinct come from? It has deep roots. Some of them pass through these candlelit corridors where a monk's job was to make sure the flame burned evenly, and the bell rang on time, and the whole carefully organized day held together around the rhythm of light. There is one more piece of this I want to give you before we move forward. A detail that when I first came across it made me sit back and just think for a while. In wealthy medieval households, the kind that could afford multiple candles burning simultaneously, it was common practice to use a specific candle as what we might call a dinner candle or an evening candle, a candle of known length and known burn rate lit at consistent time each evening, whose progress could be used to judge how long the household had been at table when it was time to dismiss the servants, when it was appropriate for guests to begin making their farewells. The candle was not just lighting the dinner, it was quietly and without being intrusive about it timing it. The candle knew when the evening was over, even when the conversation didn't want to end. There is something in that image, the candle burning down on the banquet table, everyone pretending not to notice the host glancing at it occasionally, while maintaining the fiction of timelessness that a good dinner is supposed to create. There is something in that image that feels extraordinarily human. We have always wanted to both measure our time and pretend that time is not passing. We've always wanted the candle to tell us when to stop so that we do not have to admit that we already know. The relationship between candles and time is at its deepest a story about how human beings learned to discipline themselves, to impose structure on the dark hours that had once been ungoverned, to make the night accountable in ways that the day already was. It shaped monasteries, it shaped courts, it shaped the working rhythms of craftsmen and the prayer schedules of ordinary parishes, and it was all held together, all of it, by the steady, predictable burn of a flame that someone made with their hands from fat and fibre and a particular quality of patient attention. But here is what I keep coming back to. All of that timekeeping, all of that careful measurement and organisation of hours was entirely dependent on one thing, on the candle itself being well made, consistent, reliable. A candle that burned unevenly or that sputtered and went out prematurely, or that burned too fast or too slow, that candle was not just a poor light source. It was wrong time. It was a mistake built into the structure of the day, which means that the quality of the candlemaker's work had consequences that extended far beyond simply how well you could see your dinner. It touched the organisation of everything. The prayers, the work, the meals, the governance, the rhythm of entire communities. The chandler's craft, that smelly, unglamorous, physically demanding craft we've been exploring all evening, was quietly load-bearing in ways that almost nobody acknowledged. And there was one group of people who understood this perhaps better than anyone else, who lived with candles not just as tools of light or timekeeping, but as tools of spiritual practice, of identity, of power. The story of women and candles in pre-industrial Europe is one I've been wanting to get to for a long time, not just because it is historically important, though it absolutely is, but because it is the part of this story that history has been most systematic about forgetting. And I think that is worth correcting. There is a particular kind of historical erasure that is so complete, so systematic, and so long-standing that it stops feeling like erasure at all. It just feels like the way things were. And one of the clearest examples of this in the history we've been tracing together tonight is the near-total disappearance of women from the official record of candle making in pre-industrial Europe. I want to be precise about what I mean by that because I'm not making a vague or rhetorical claim. I mean that if you read the primary historical sources for this craft, the guild records the municipal documents, the craft ordinances, the merchant accounts, the names you encounter are overwhelmingly male. The masters are men. The guild wardens are men. The apprenticeship contracts are almost universally between male masters and male apprentices. The documents that have survived and that historians have traditionally used to reconstruct this world were produced by institutions, guilds, courts, municipalities that were formally organized around male participation. And if you stopped at these documents, you would conclude that candle making was essentially a male trade practiced by men organized by men, with women appearing only at the margins as the wives of chandlers or occasionally as inheritors of workshops when their husbands died. But the documents are not the whole story, not even close. Let me show you what I mean. Start with the household. The most fundamental site of candle production in pre-industrial Europe was not the professional workshop. It was not the guild-registered chandlery. It was the domestic kitchen and the space behind the farmhouse and the cottage hearth where a woman managed the household's fat supply and decided week by week how much to render for cooking and how much to set aside for light. This was not secondary or supporting work. This was the primary form of candle production for the majority of European households for most of the period we have been discussing. The professional chandler supplied those who could afford to buy, but most households in medieval and early modern Europe produced at least some of their own light from their own saved kitchen drippings, processed and dipped and stored by the women of the household as a routine part of the domestic labour that kept the family fed, warm-clothed and illuminated. This work was not glamorous. It was not formally organised. It was not recorded in guild documents. It was simply part of what managing a household meant in the same category as bread baking and herb drying and the mending of clothes. And because it was domestic, it was largely invisible to the kinds of records that have survived. The historian Ruth Goodman, who has spent decades researching and practically reconstructing the material life of pre-industrial England, has written and spoken extensively about the centrality of women's labour to household lighting in this period. Her research makes clear that the management of fat, saving it, rendering it, deciding how to allocate it between cooking and candle making, actually producing the candles themselves, was almost universally understood in the English historical sources she examined as women's work. Not because women were assigned the least skilled tasks, but because managing the household's resources, including its light resources, was the woman's domain. It was her expertise, her decision-making, her craft. That expertise had real economic value. A household where the woman managed fat, efficiently producing a sufficient supply of candles to last through the winter without waste, was a household that functioned better than one where this management was poor. The quality of the light in your home, the length of your evenings, the hours you could work after dark, the warmth and functionality of the domestic space, depended substantially on the skill of the person who managed the fat supply. And that person in most European households for most of this period was a woman. Now let us move from the household to the itinerant trade, because here the historical record becomes somewhat more explicit and considerably more interesting. The itinerant chandler, the travelling candle maker who went from house to house, offering to render a household's saved fat into finished candles, was a recognisable and important figure in the medieval and early modern English economy, and what the available records suggest is that a significant portion of itinerant chandlers were women. Not all of them. Not even necessarily a majority in all regions and periods. But enough that their presence was sufficiently common to appear in the documentary record in court cases, in market records, in the occasional municipal document, as a normal and expected feature of the trade. Why were women well represented in itinerant chandlery specifically? The answer makes sense when you think about it from the perspective of the economic and social structures of the time. Itinerant chandlery required skill knowledge of rendering and dipping, but it did not require the capital investment of a guild-registered workshop. It did not require formal guild membership, at least not in the initial informal stages. It required mobility, basic equipment, a rendering pot, prepared wicks, a portable dipping frame of some kind, and an established network of households willing to pay for the service. This was an economic niche that could be entered with relatively limited capital and in which the skills required were precisely the domestic skills that women had already developed in the management of their own households. A woman who'd spent 20 years managing her family's fat and candle production and who had developed genuine skill in that work could in principle translate that expertise into a small independent income by offering the service to other households. No guild examination required, no 7-year apprenticeship, no formal registration, just the knowledge, the equipment, and the network of clients. This form of economic participation in formal, skill-based operating in the spaces between the formally organized guild economy was, I think, considerably more common among women in pre-industrial Europe than the official records suggest. Because the official records almost by definition documented the formal economy. The informal economy, where much of women's economic activity took place, left far less paper behind. There is a specific detail from English legal records of the 14th and 15th centuries that I find both revealing and somewhat poignant. Cases occasionally appear in the courts of this period, involving women who were prosecuted for practicing trades without the appropriate guild membership or license, including chandlery. These prosecutions tell us two things simultaneously. First, that women were practicing these trades outside the formal guild structure in sufficient numbers that the guilds considered it worth taking legal action about. And second, that the women being prosecuted often had no formal standing to defend themselves within the guild system, because the guild system was not designed to include them. The trade they were practicing was real. The skill was real. The economic need they were filling was real. But the institutional framework refused to recognize them, and when the guild wardens came to enforce their monopoly, these women had very limited recourse. This is not a simple story of oppression, though it contains elements of that. It is a more complicated story about how formal institutions, guilds, courts, municipal governments interacted with the informal economic realities of how ordinary people actually lived and worked. The gap between the two is where women's economic activity largely lived, and that gap has been systematically underrepresented in the history books, because the history books were mostly written from the perspective of the formal institutions. Now the guild dimension of women's candle-making history has one redeeming provision that I want to give you because I mentioned it briefly earlier, and it deserves a fuller examination. In the London Chandlers' Guilds, both the Tallow Chandlers and the Wax Chandlers, there is documented evidence that women could and did hold full guild membership as widows inheriting their husband's standing. This was not unique to chandlery. It was a feature of many London guilds, though not all of them, and the degree to which it was actually available to women varied considerably in practice. But the principle was established: a woman who had worked alongside her husband throughout his career, who knew the trade, who knew the suppliers and the clients who could manage the workshop and the apprentices and the accounts, that woman was recognized at least formally as having the competence to continue the business. Some of these women did exactly that and did it well. The records of the London Chandlers' Guilds from the 14th and 15th centuries include a handful of women listed as active masters. Not many, but enough to establish that it happened. These were not women operating under the shadow of a deceased husband's name as a legal fiction. They were running workshops, training apprentices, supplying clients, meeting guild obligations, practicing the craft. Their names appear in the records, but rarely in the histories. And I think that is a specific kind of injustice, small in scale, but real the erasure that happens not through any single act of deliberate suppression, but through the accumulated weight of centuries of someone deciding that the names worth recording and the stories worth telling were the male ones. I want to give you one more dimension of this history before we move on, because it connects to something larger than just the candle trade. Women's relationship with candles in pre-industrial Europe was not only economic, it was also profoundly ritual and symbolic in ways that have received almost no historical attention. In many regional folk traditions across England, France, Germany, and Scandinavia, the management of fire and light within the household was considered specifically women's domain, not just practically, but spiritually. The woman of the household was the keeper of the hearth fire. She was the person who ensured that the fire did not go out overnight. She was the person who rekindled it in the morning, and the candle as an extension of the domestic fire into portable controllable light fell naturally within this domain of female responsibility. This meant that the lighting of a candle in many pre-industrial European households was a woman's act, not a man's. The household candle was lit by female hands, managed by female attention, extinguished by female decision. The man might carry the candle from one room to another, might use it for his work or his reading. But its origin, the rendering, the dipping, the storing, the lighting, moved through a chain of female labour and female knowledge that was as invisible as it was essential. And here is what I keep coming back to when I think about this dimension of the story. Every candle we have discussed tonight, the rushlight soaked in kitchen fat, the tallow candle burning on the craftsman's table, the beeswax candle illuminating the cathedral, the carefully rationed light of a winter evening in a medieval cottage, every single one of those flames passed through the hands of a woman at some point in its existence, either in its making or in its management or in both. The light that sustained European civilization through its long nights was produced and maintained and tended by people whose names did not make it into the guild records, whose knowledge did not make it into the craft manuals, and whose contribution did not make it into the histories. That is a significant absence. And I think for anyone who has been listening to this story and has found themselves moved by the humanity of it, by the rushlight and the dipping frame and the knowledge that lived in the hands, I think the recognition of that absence makes the story more complete. Not darker exactly, more honest, more whole. The full history of candle making in pre-industrial Europe is not just the story of the chandler with his guild certificate and his workshop on the edge of the city. It is also the story of the woman who saved fat through a whole autumn and rendered it in the kitchen and dipped wicks on a cold November morning and put the finished candles in the wooden box on the wall and took one out each evening and lit it and watched it burn and knew from years of experience exactly how long the evening had before the light ran out. That woman did not have a coat of arms. She did not have a guild certificate. She may not have had a name that survived in any document, but she had something that mattered just as much in the actual daily fabric of human life. She had the knowledge and the skill and the patience and the care, and the light in her home was real. Now there is one dimension of this long story that we have not yet fully reckoned with, and it is not about domestic kitchens or guild halls or the quiet labour of rendering fat. It is about something much louder, much more deliberately constructed, much more self-conscious in the way it deployed light as a form of communication. We have talked about candles as a necessity, as a craft, as a technology, as a keeper of time, as a vehicle for women's hidden labour and expertise. But we have not yet talked about candles as power, as theatre, as the language that kings and lords and military commanders used to say without a single spoken word, exactly what they needed people to understand about who they were and what they controlled. The full story of what a candle meant as an instrument of political display, as a companion to war, as the witness that stood at the bedside of the dying, that story lived and breathed in the pre-industrial world for centuries. And before we watch that world come to an end, I want to show you exactly what was at stake. Because when the candle was at the height of its power, it was speaking a language that everyone understood, and it is a language worth learning even now. Power has always needed an audience. This is something I've come to believe pretty firmly after spending a long time reading history. It does not matter what era you're looking at, what culture, what kind of leadership structure. Power, real power, the kind that shapes how people behave and what they believe is possible, has almost never been content to exist quietly. It has always wanted to be seen. It has always reached for symbols, for objects and spaces and rituals that communicate without words that certain people occupy a different order of existence than everyone else. And in pre-industrial Europe, few objects did this work more efficiently, more consistently, or more elegantly than the candle. I want to take you into 3 very different spaces in this part of our story. 3 rooms, 3 contexts, 3 completely different uses of the same small flame, and I want to show you how in each of them, the candle was doing something far more complex than simply providing light. It was speaking a language that everyone in the room understood instantly, and that told them with complete clarity what kind of world they were in and where they stood within it. The first space is a great hall, a banquet. Let's say we are in England sometime in the late 14th century, the reign of Richard II, if you want a specific anchor. Richard was, among other things, famously concerned with the aesthetics of power. He introduced new protocols of formal address to the English court, insisted on elaborate ceremony at meals, and was deeply invested in the idea that the visual environment of kingship should communicate magnificence. He understood intuitively what modern political scientists would later call the theatre of power. At a major royal feast during this period, the Great Hall of the palace would be lit by candles in a quantity and of a quality that was by any reasonable standard extravagant. Not dozens, hundreds. Beeswax candles, the expensive ones, the clean-burning, sweet-smelling ones we discussed earlier, arranged in large iron or bronze chandeliers suspended from the ceiling in wall sconces along the length of the hall, and on the table itself in elaborate holders that were themselves demonstrations of craftsmanship and wealth. The household accounts of Edward III, Richard's grandfather, record expenditures on wax candles for major court feasts that ran to sums representing a significant fraction of what a skilled craftsman might earn in an entire year. For a single evening. This was not wastefulness in the modern sense. This was investment in a very specific return. Every guest in that hall, every ambassador, every bishop, every noble, every foreign dignitary was receiving a message that was delivered not through a speech or a proclamation, but through the air itself, through the warmth, the scent, the quality of the light falling on the tablecloths and the silver plate and the faces of the people around them. The message was, look at what we can afford to burn. Look at how much light we have to give away in a single evening. This is what power looks like. This is what it smells like. And if you're sitting at this table, you are close to it. The contrast with the experience of the ordinary person who might glimpse this feast from outside, who went home to a tallow candle, maybe too carefully rationed to last through the evening's necessary tasks, was not accidental. It was the point. Household accounts survive from several major English and French noble families of this period, and when you read them carefully, the candle expenditures tell a story that the formal historical narratives often miss. The accounts of John of Gaunt, one of the most powerful nobles in 14th century England, Duke of Lancaster, effectively a king in his own financial territory, record systematic large-scale purchasing of beeswax in quantities measured not by the pound, but by the hundredweight. His household burned beeswax candles essentially continuously in the great chambers of his various residences, not just for feasts for every evening, because maintaining the ambient standard of lighting in a great noble household was itself a constant ongoing statement of status. And here is the detail that I find particularly revealing. These accounts distinguish carefully between the candles used in different parts of the household. The great hall and the lord's private chambers received the best beeswax candles. The kitchens and the servants' quarters received tallow. The hierarchy of light within a single building mirrored the hierarchy of the people who lived in it. You could navigate the social structure of a medieval noble household simply by following the quality of the light from room to room. Now let's step out of the banquet hall and into a very different context: war. This is not the first association most people make with candles, but the connection is real and historically significant in ways that tend to get overlooked. Military campaigns in pre-industrial Europe were logistical operations of enormous complexity, and among the many supplies that an army needed to function food fodder for horses, weapons, clothing light was not a minor consideration. Operations that required work after dark, the preparation of equipment in the hours before dawn, the management of supply lines and communication. All of these depended on reliable, portable, consistent light. The armies of medieval and early modern Europe used tallow candles extensively, not beeswax that was far too expensive for military supply at scale, and in any case the symbolic dimension of beeswax would have been lost entirely in a camp full of soldiers. Tallow was practical. Tallow was available wherever there were cattle and sheep, which is to say almost everywhere an army travelled. And the rendering of tallow for candles was a skill that could be performed in the field using animals slaughtered for food, producing light as a byproduct of feeding the troops. This was not a small consideration. The fat recovered from slaughtering animals to feed a medieval army was a resource that an organised quartermaster would not simply discard. It was collected, rendered, and used for candles, for waterproofing leather equipment, for lubricating machinery, for a dozen practical applications. Nothing was wasted. Everything had a use, and light was always a use. The connection between candles and military life also shows up in a slightly different dimension: the use of candlelight for communication and signalling, not in the elaborate semaphore sense that came later, but in the simpler and more fundamental sense that a light in a specific window or the absence of a light at an expected time communicated information that could matter enormously in the context of a siege or a campaign. Medieval military accounts contain references to lighting signals, a candle placed in a window to indicate that a gate would be left unguarded or extinguished to signal danger. The candler's communication device long before any formal system of signals was developed, and there is a specific military logistics detail that I want to mention because I think it illustrates the practical reality of this more vividly than any general description can. In the records of English military campaigns in France during what historians call the 100 Years' War, that long, grinding, complicated conflict that stretched across most of the 14th and 15th centuries, there are entries in supply accounts for candles, purchased specifically for the use of commanders working on maps and documents after dark. Military planning, in other words, required light. Strategy was developed by candlelight. The decisions that determined the fates of thousands of people were made in rooms lit by rendered animal fat. History likes to tell the story of war, through its grand moments, the charges, the sieges, the turning points. but the actual texture of military life, the long hours of preparation and planning and logistics management that made those moments possible was candlelit. It was slow and careful and often cold, and it happened in the hours when the soldiers were sleeping and the commanders were still working the tallow flame, casting its smoky, imperfect light over maps drawn on expensive parchment and letters written with cold fingers. Now the third space, and this one I think carries the deepest emotional resonance of all three: death. Candles and death have been companions for so long and in so many cultures that we barely notice the connection anymore. When someone passes away, we light candles. When there is a memorial, there are candles. The image is so familiar it has become almost reflexive, but I want to slow down with it for a moment and ask, where does this come from? What does it mean? And what did it mean in the specific context of pre-industrial European life, where death was a much more constant and immediate presence than it is for most people in the developed world today? In medieval Christian practice, candles played a specific theologically grounded role in the rituals surrounding death. When a person was dying, candles were lit around the deathbed, not for illumination, though they provided that too, but as an active spiritual intervention. The belief was that light was a protection against the forces of darkness that might attempt to claim the soul in its moment of transition. The candle was a guardian, a declaration that this person dying in this bed was under the protection of the light and that the darkness, literal and spiritual, was not welcome here. After death, candles were placed around the body for the duration of what was called the wake, the period during which the body remained in the home before burial. The wake was in its origins precisely what the word suggests: a watching. Someone or several people remained awake through the night with the dead, and the candles burned throughout. This was partly practical. The body needed to be monitored, and darkness made that impossible, but it was also deeply symbolic. The continuous flame was a continuous presence, a statement that this person, though dead, was not abandoned, was not left in the dark. The economics of death candles are honestly one of the more poignant details in this entire history. For poor families in medieval Europe, providing candles for a proper wake and funeral was a genuine financial burden, sometimes a severe one. The expectation that a person of any social standing would be buried with an appropriate number of candles burning was powerful enough that families would go into debt to meet it. Church records and municipal charitable accounts from England and France contain references to provisions made specifically to help poor families afford funeral candles, either by donating candles directly or by subsidizing the purchase. Think about what this tells you about the role of candles in medieval society. They were important enough at the moment of death that communities organized formal charity around, ensuring that nobody's funeral went without them. The candle was not optional, not at the end. And on the other end of the social scale, the candles at great funerals were themselves a form of political communication. When a king or a great noble died in medieval Europe, the funeral arrangements, including the number, size, and quality of candles burned, were carefully calculated to communicate the magnitude of the loss and the power of the lineage that continued. The funeral of Edward I of England in 1307 involved candles burned in quantities that were specifically noted by contemporary chroniclers as evidence of the king's greatness. Numbers were recorded. The expenditure was documented. Because the candles at the funeral were not just mourning, they were a message to everyone who attended about the kind of dynasty they were serving. I want to pause here and ask you something because I think it connects to something genuinely personal. Have you ever been at a candlelit memorial, a vigil, a service, a moment of remembrance, and felt something shift in you? Something that is hard to name but is real, I think most people have, and I think that feeling is not accidental, and it is not simply aesthetic. It is the accumulated weight of centuries of this exact practice. The candle at a memorial is doing something that goes much deeper than lighting a room. It is participating in a tradition of human presence in the face of loss that stretches back further than most of us ever think about. The candle says we are here. We are watching. The dark does not win tonight. That is very old. Older than the Christianity that formalized it in Europe. Older than the specific liturgical traditions that surrounded it. It touches something in us that predates any particular religion or culture, the fundamental human instinct to respond to loss with light. To refuse in the face of the most final darkness, to simply sit in the dark. And this the symbolic weight of the candle in the context of power and war and death brings me back to something I said at the very beginning of this series of stories in that first section about the world before the candle. That the candle was never really just about light, that it was always doing more than illuminating a room. The banquet hall candles were about hierarchy and display. The military camp candles were about logistics and survival. The deathbed candles were about presence and love and the refusal to let someone go alone into the dark. Same object, same small flame, completely different meanings shaped entirely by who was burning it and why, and in the presence of what. That capacity of a single simple object to carry entirely different meanings, depending on its context, that is not a small thing. That is in its quiet way a kind of miracle of human culture. The ability to pour symbolic weight into a material object until it means more than its physical reality would suggest possible. The chandler who made these candles, the person who spent their days dipping wicks in rendered fat arguing with guild wardens, managing apprentices fighting off the smell of their own trade, that person made all of these meanings possible. Every act of mourning lit by a tallow candle. Every feast illuminated by beeswax. Every military dispatch written by the light of a flame produced from a slaughtered animal's fat. All of it passed through those hands before it reached its final purpose. And yet there is one more dimension of this story that we've not fully reckoned with yet. One that is not about power or death or warfare, but about something much quieter and, in my opinion, much more interesting. It is about what happens to a craft when the world around it starts to change, when new materials arrive, when new economics reshape who can afford what, when the slow, patient, handmade world begins to feel the first tremors of something faster and more mechanical than anything it has known before. The pre-industrial world of candle making was not static. It was always moving, always adapting, always finding new ways to solve old problems. And in the 2 centuries before the Industrial Revolution changed everything, some of the most fascinating innovations in this entire history quietly took shape. That transformation and what it meant for the people who made candles and the people who burned them is exactly where we're headed. There is a particular kind of ending that history gives us, sometimes not a dramatic collapse, not a sudden rupture, but a slow, quiet fade. The kind where something that was absolutely central to daily life for centuries simply becomes unnecessary, becomes quaint, becomes the sort of thing people do for atmosphere rather than survival, and the people who lived through that transition often did not notice it happening until it was already over. The ending of the pre-industrial candle world was that kind of ending. It did not happen on a single date. It did not have a single cause. It was the accumulation of several developments, each one nudging the craft further from necessity toward obsolescence, until one day the chandler looked up from the dipping frame and realized that the world had moved on without making much of an announcement about it. But before we get to the ending, I want to give you the last chapter of innovation, because the century and a half before the Industrial Revolution brought some of the most genuinely interesting technical developments in the entire history of candle making, and they came as so many things do from a completely unexpected direction. From the ocean, specifically from the sperm whale. The sperm whale is an extraordinary animal in many ways, but the one that concerns us here is a substance found in a large cavity in its enormous head, a liquid wax called spermaceti. Nobody in the early days of whaling quite knew what to make of it. It pooled in the head of a harvested whale in quantities that would run to several barrels, and it had a consistency unlike anything else in nature liquid at body temperature, solidifying into a white, almost crystalline wax when cooled. For a long time, whalers simply used it as a lubricant or discarded it. Then sometime in the early 18th century, the exact date and location are not entirely clear, but the evidence points to the American whaling industry centered in New England, particularly Nantucket and New Bedford. Someone discovered that spermaceti made an extraordinary candle, not just better than tallow, better than beeswax in several specific and important ways. Spermaceti candles burned brighter than beeswax. They produced a whiter, cleaner light that was noticeably superior to any previously available candle material. They did not produce the foul smell of tallow. They had a significantly higher melting point than either tallow or beeswax, somewhere around 122 degrees Fahrenheit, which meant they would not soften and bend in summer heat the way other candles would. And they burned more slowly, lasting longer per inch of candle than their predecessors. These properties made spermaceti candles so reliably consistent in their light output that they became the basis for the first standardized unit of light measurement. The original standard candle, the unit from which the modern measure of light intensity, the candela, ultimately derives, was defined as the light produced by a spermaceti candle of a specific size burning at a specific rate. For the first time in human history, light itself had a measurable, reproducible standard, and it was a whale. The growth of the whaling industry in the late 18th century made spermaceti available in quantities large enough to supply a real market. In wealthy households in England, France, and the American colonies, spermaceti candles became the premium product, the thing you burned when you wanted the best light money could buy. They were expensive, significantly more so than beeswax, but for those who could afford them, the quality was simply unmatched. And here is an interesting wrinkle that I think says something true about how progress actually works. The rise of spermaceti candles did not replace tallow candles for the majority of the population. It created a new tier at the top of the market while tallow continued to serve everyone else. The social stratification of candlelight that we traced back to the medieval beeswax versus tallow divide was not resolved by innovation. It was extended upward. There were now 3 tiers instead of 2 tallow for the poor beeswax, for the comfortable middle, and spermaceti for the genuinely wealthy. More innovation. Same basic hierarchy. Then in the 1820s, something happened that genuinely disrupted the structure rather than simply adding another layer to it. 2 French chemists, Michel-Eugène Chevreul and Joseph-Louis Gay-Lussac, working in Paris, made a discovery that had been waiting in the chemistry of animal fat for centuries without anyone recognizing it. They found a way to separate stearic acid from the glycerin in animal fat. The glycerin, which was responsible for the terrible smell of tallow candles, could be removed. What remained was a pure, hard, clean-burning substance they called stearin. Stearin candles were patented in 1825. They were a genuine revelation. They were harder than tallow, which meant they kept their shape in warm weather. They burned more cleanly with far less smoke and odour. They were cheaper to produce than beeswax, and they could be made in large quantities from the same animal fat that had always supplied the tallow chandlers, just processed differently. The raw material was the same, the chemistry was new, and the result was a candle that for the first time in history gave ordinary people access to something approaching the clean burning quality that previously only beeswax could provide. Stearin candles are still widely used in Europe today. If you've ever burned what is sometimes called a church candle white firm, relatively odourless, there is a reasonable chance it contained stearin. That chemistry worked out in a Paris laboratory in the early 19th century is still in your home 200 years later. I find that kind of longevity genuinely moving. But the development that truly ended the pre-industrial era of candle making, the one that transformed the craft from a skilled hand-based trade into an industrial process, came in 1834, and it came not from a chemist, but from a pewterer in Manchester, England. His name was Joseph Morgan, and what he patented was a machine. Morgan's candle-making machine used a cylinder with a movable piston to produce moulded candles in a continuous process. You fed the raw material in the machine, formed it around a wick. The piston ejected the finished candle as it solidified, and the process began again immediately. The machine could produce approximately 1,500 candles per hour. 1,500 candles per hour. Let that sit for a moment against what we've been talking about all evening, against the chandler with the dipping frame building each candle layer by layer through 20 or 30 passes, producing perhaps 300 candles in an entire working day with the help of apprentices. Morgan's machine produced that many in about 12 minutes. The economics of candle production changed overnight. The price of candles dropped substantially and continued dropping as the machine spread. The skilled chandler, the person who had spent 7 years learning how to read the temperature of a vat by the behavior of its surface, who could straighten a warping candle with a practiced touch, who understood through their body the precise rhythm of dip and cool and dip again, that person was not replaced immediately. But they were gradually and then rapidly displaced. Their particular knowledge became less valuable. The market that had sustained them began to reorganize around mechanical production. By the 1850s and 1860s, industrial candle manufacturing was the dominant form in England and France, and spreading rapidly across Europe and North America. Price's Candles, based in London, founded by William Wilson in 1830, became by the late 19th century the largest candle manufacturer in the world, using steam distillation processes to manufacture from an extraordinary range of raw materials, including skin fat, bone fat, fish oil, and industrial greases. The craft that had been practiced by individual chandlers in small workshops for centuries was now a factory operation. And then, in 1879, Thomas Edison demonstrated the first practical incandescent light bulb. I have always thought there is something almost poignant about the timing. The candle industry had just spent 50 years modernizing itself, industrializing, becoming more efficient and more affordable than at any point in its history. Stearin and paraffin had democratized clean light in a way that was genuinely new. The industrial chandler had finally solved the problem of making good candles cheaply and at scale. And then electricity walked in and made the entire question irrelevant. Not immediately, not for everyone at once. Rural areas of Europe continued to rely on candles well into the 20th century. The transition to electrical lighting was uneven and in many places slow. But the trajectory was clear from the moment Edison's bulb proved commercially viable. Candles were no longer the primary technology of light. They were no longer the thing you absolutely had to have. They had become in the space of a single generation optional, and optional things become over time something different from what they were when they were necessary. They become meaningful in a new way, chosen rather than compelled, used for atmosphere rather than survival, appreciated in a register that necessity never really allows for. Which brings me to the question I've been building toward all evening. The question that when I first really sat with it made me want to tell this entire story in the first place. What did we lose when light became easy? I want to be careful here because I'm not interested in simple nostalgia. I'm not suggesting that we should go back to tallow candles and rushlight and stumbling around in the dark for half the year. I enjoy my electric lights enormously. I enjoy being able to read at midnight without managing a flame or worrying about when the candle runs out. Progress in lighting is on balance genuinely good. But I do think something real was lost, and I think it is worth naming it clearly. What we lost, I think, was a certain quality of relationship between people, and light between effort and illumination between the human body and the material world. When light required labour, when you had to harvest rushes or save fat or dip wicks or purchase carefully from a chandler whose product represented someone's skilled hours, light had weight. It had meaning that was built into the cost of it. When you sat down in the evening with a single candle, you were aware on some level that the flame in front of you was the product of someone's work, that it was finite, that when it was gone the evening was over unless you had another one. That awareness, that constant low-level consciousness of the cost and the limit of light shaped how people used their evenings in ways that we genuinely cannot fully recover. The historian Wolfgang Schivelbusch, in his landmark study of the history of artificial light, makes an argument that I find genuinely compelling, that the transition to cheap, abundant, controllable light fundamentally changed the human experience of time. Not just that people could do more things after dark, but that the quality of time itself changed. Time stopped being something that the sun and the candle allocated. It became something that human beings could, for the first time, organize almost entirely according to their own preferences. The night became available in a new way. This was in many respects a liberation, but liberation always involves leaving something behind. What was left behind in this case was the particular discipline of the candlelit evening. The way that limited light concentrated attention gathered people together enforced a kind of focus that unlimited light does not. There is a reason that restaurants dim their lights, a reason that we light candles for romantic dinners and memorial services and moments when we want to feel that something matters. We are reaching back unconsciously for something we gave up when light became a switch rather than a flame. We are trying to recover in small, deliberate doses the sense of presence and weight and warmth that the candle carried when it was not a choice but a necessity. And here is what I keep coming back to at the end of all of this: the people who made those candles, the chandlers, the apprentices, the women who dipped wicks in their kitchens, the monks who tended the candles that kept time for whole communities, the unknown person who figured out that a rushlight burned longer at an angle. Those people are almost entirely absent from history. Their names are mostly gone. Their workshops are gone. The specific knowledge they carried in their hands is gone. But the light they made, the light they shaped through years of patient, smelly, physically demanding, quietly essential work, that light reached into every corner of pre-industrial European life. It was there when children were born and when old people died. It was there in the monastery at 2 a.m. when the bell rang for matins. It was there in the great hall when the king feasted and on the battlefield when the commander planned the next day's action. It was there in the peasant's cottage when the family gathered close because light was precious and warmth was precious and the dark outside was very large. All of that history, all of those lives, all of that meaning, held in something you could cup in your hand, something that weighed less than a stone, something that burned away layer by layer, giving its whole self to the light and then was gone. I find that honestly, sincerely, one of the most beautiful things I know about the past. So the next time you light a candle, whether it is for a birthday cake or a quiet evening or just because you like the way it looks, take one moment to feel the weight of it. Not the physical weight, the other kind, the centuries of hands that shape this thing you are holding, the rushlight in the Scottish cottage, the beeswax taper on the cathedral altar, the dipping frame in the workshop in Paris or London or Cologne, the chandler moving down the row of wicks in the cool morning air, building light one thin layer at a time. That is all in there, in the flame. In the particular irreplaceable quality of candlelight that no electric bulb has ever quite managed to replicate, that warmth, that flicker, that sense that the light is alive and present in a way that a switched-on lamp simply is not. You're not just burning wax when you light a candle, You're standing at the end of a very long, very human story, and I think that is worth knowing. Thank you. Genuinely, deeply thank you for spending this time with me tonight. If you made it this far through all of it, the rushlight and the rendering yard and the guild politics and the candle clocks and everything in between, then you are exactly the kind of person I love making these stories for. Someone who finds the quiet, overlooked corners of history just as fascinating as the big dramatic moments. Someone who believes that the story of an ordinary craft told carefully enough can open up into something much larger. If this story gave you something, a new way of seeing a candle, a question you had not thought to ask before, a small appreciation for a world that was harder and stranger and more interesting than we usually give it credit for, then please leave a comment and tell me. I read them. Every one of them matters to me more than I know how to say. And if you want more of this, more of these quiet stories, these slow dives into the history that most people walk past without noticing, then stay close. Because the next story I am building for you is one that I think is going to surprise you completely. It touches on something that was in every home in pre-industrial Europe, that shaped daily life in ways nobody ever talked about, and that has a history so strange and layered and unexpectedly moving that I genuinely cannot wait to share it with you. It is coming soon, and it will be worth the wait. For now, rest well, sleep deeply, and the next time the room goes dark, remember, for most of human history, someone worked very hard to make sure it did not stay that way. Good night.